I had been driving for hours, the winding forest roads stretching ahead like a gray ribbon in the fading light. I had taken this trip to escape the city, the constant noise, the weight of responsibilities that seemed to pile higher with every passing day. My plan was simple: a weekend in a remote cabin, somewhere deep in the woods where I could think, breathe, and be alone with myself. I had found the cabin online, a small, rustic structure not far from a narrow dirt road that cut through thick pine forests. The reviews were sparse, but positive, and the pictures showed a cabin with basic amenities: a wood stove, a small kitchenette, a loft for sleeping, and a porch with a view of a creek below. As I drove closer, the air grew colder and the light dimmer, despite it being mid-afternoon. Shadows of the tall trees stretched across the road like dark fingers. I could feel the quiet pressing in around me, a kind of silence that was almost too heavy, the kind that made every small sound. My tires on gravel, the creak of the steering wheel feel amplified. When I finally arrived at the cabin, it was tucked behind a cluster of trees, almost hidden. Its wooden exterior was weathered, the paint peeling, but the structure looked solid. A thin plume of smoke rose from the chimney, although I wasn't sure if anyone was inside. I pulled into the small clearing, my car crunching over fallen pine needles. As I stepped out, the air hit me sharply, colder than I had expected. The forest smelled damp and earthy. The creek murmured somewhere nearby, its sound faint but constant. I walked up to the porch, testing the door handle, and found it unlocked. That was when I first noticed the cabin's isolation. From the porch, I could see nothing but forest in every direction. The nearest road was invisible through the thick underbrush, and there were no other cabins in sight. The sense of solitude was complete, almost suffocating. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and smoke. Dust coated the shelves and the edges of furniture, but the space was tidy. The stove looked usable, and there was a stack of firewood in the corner. I set my bag down and began unpacking. I had brought simple food, a few books, a flashlight, and extra blankets. I decided to light a fire, wanting warmth and comfort as the sun dipped lower behind the trees. The kindling caught quickly, and the flames licked the edges of the stove, casting flickering light across the cabin's interior. The first night passed uneventfully. I sat near the fire for hours, watching the flames and listening to the wind through the trees. It was soothing at first, the kind of quiet that I had been craving. But as darkness deepened, the sounds of the forest became more noticeable. The rustle of branches, the occasional snap of a twig, the distant cry of a bird or animal. They were normal sounds, I told myself, but they seemed closer, sharper, more deliberate in the absolute darkness surrounding the cabin. I tried to read, but my eyes kept drifting to the windows, to the black void outside. Sleep came slowly, uneasy, punctuated by the creaks and groans of the cabin settling. The next morning, I decided to explore the area. I packed a small backpack with water, some snacks, and a map I had printed before the trip. The forest was dense, the trees so close together that sunlight barely touched the ground. The air was damp, and the ground was soft underfoot, covered in moss and fallen leaves. I followed a faint trail that led away from the cabin and down toward the creek I had seen from the porch. The water was clear and cold, running over smooth rocks. I knelt to drink and splashed some on my face, the sound of the creek soothing in contrast to the oppressive forest. I noticed something strange as I walked back toward the cabin. The trail I had taken seemed less defined, almost as if it had been partially erased. Small branches lay across it, and there were no clear footprints, not even mine, which I had thought would mark the soft ground. I shook it off, telling myself I had misremembered the path. I reached the cabin in the early afternoon and spent some time tidying the interior, stacking more firewood, and checking the stove and windows. Everything seemed fine, yet a subtle unease had started to creep in. It was as if I was not alone, even though I knew logically that no one else could be here. The next evening brought the first real sense of fear. I had just finished eating a simple dinner when I heard a sound outside, faint at first but growing clearer, a deliberate, slow crunching of footsteps on the dirt and pine needles. I froze, straining to listen. The steps were not near the cabin's road or path, but somewhere in the trees, circling, moving closer and then farther away. My heart started to race, and I felt a cold sweat on the back of my neck. I grabbed the flashlight and shined it through the windows, sweeping the beam across the forest. The light caught nothing. There was no movement, no figure, nothing but shadows. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer, maybe, or a fox, but the rhythm of the steps felt too human. My mind started to race with scenarios I didn't want to think about. I checked all the doors and windows again, making sure they were locked, even though the cabin was small and simple. I moved the heavy wooden chairs against the doors, more for a sense of security than necessity. I stayed near the fire for the rest of the night, the flashlight in one hand, a piece of firewood in the other, listening to every sound outside. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I fell into a fitful sleep, jerking awake at every noise. The following day, I tried to regain a sense of normalcy. I chopped more firewood, cleaned the cabin, and even tried to explore a new trail farther into the forest. The isolation was beginning to press on me, making me over-aware of every crack, rustle, and shadow. I kept checking the time, hoping that help or human contact was not too far away. By late afternoon, I noticed something unsettling. Marks on the dirt near the cabin. At first, I thought it was animal tracks, but they were too precise, too deliberate. Footprints, human footprints, circling the cabin. They were spaced far apart, as if whoever had made them was walking slowly, observing. My heart pounded as I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a local hiker had wandered near the cabin, I told myself. But the tracks weren't random, they seemed purposeful, moving in a pattern around the cabin, always keeping a distance but never leaving entirely. Panic rose, but I forced myself to stay calm. I documented the footprints with photos and measurements, thinking I could show them to someone later. I spent the night barricading the doors and windows again, moving the chairs and keeping the fire alive. The third day was the worst. I woke early to a sound I could not immediately identify. A low, deliberate tapping at the cabin walls, faint at first, then louder. I froze, straining to locate it. It wasn't the wind or the trees. It was someone outside, testing the structure. My rational mind tried to deny it, but the evidence of the footprints, the sounds, and the earlier steps left no room for denial. I had no way to call for help. My phone had no signal, and I had not told anyone exactly where I was. Fear tightened around me like a vice. I spent that day preparing. I barricaded the doors more thoroughly, stacking firewood and furniture to create obstacles. I gathered knives from the kitchen, and I kept a heavy branch nearby, something to defend myself with if needed. I stayed near the windows, watching the forest, seeing shadows move in the distance but never close enough to identify clearly. Hours passed, and the tension became unbearable. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made my heart leap. By nightfall, I had built a crude but secure sleeping area in the loft, surrounded by furniture and tools, ready to react to any intrusion. Sleep was impossible that night. I took shifts pacing the cabin, monitoring the shadows, listening to every sound. Occasionally, I thought I saw figures moving in the dark between the trees, always staying just out of reach. The fear was relentless, gnawing at me, but I refused to leave the cabin until daylight. When morning came, I dared to step outside cautiously. The forest was calm, quiet as if nothing had happened. I inspected the perimeter. The footprints were gone. No one had entered the cabin during the night, but the sense of being watched remained. I realized then that the most dangerous part of the experience was not the unknown, but the isolation. Being alone with the forest and someone or something watching with no one to turn to had created a kind of pressure that made every sound and shadow feel amplified. I spent the next day carefully planning my exit. I packed everything I had brought and left no sign that anyone had stayed there, hoping to avoid confrontation if anyone returned. I stayed alert the entire way back, my senses sharpened by the constant vigilance. By the time I reached the main road and then the first gas station, I felt a wave of relief so strong it almost made me dizzy. I was safe, and I had escaped whatever had been circling the cabin. The experience left a permanent impression on me. the way isolation could distort perception, how fear could magnify every small sound and shadow into something overwhelming. I never returned to that area, and I made a rule after that trip. No matter how much I wanted solitude, I would always let someone know where I was going, always have a reliable way to call for help, and always trust my instincts when something felt wrong. It took weeks for my sleep to normalize after that trip, for the constant tension in my chest to fade. I replayed every detail in my mind, every sound, every movement, trying to make sense of it. But I realized that sometimes there is no sense to be made. There are people out there, strangers, who can create fear in ways nothing else can. And sometimes the forest, the isolation, and the raw vulnerability of being alone are enough to make you feel hunted, even if no one is actually trying to harm you. I never returned to that cabin, but I did learn something important. Preparation and caution are the only defenses against situations where your instincts scream danger. The fear I felt was real, grounded in reality, and surviving it required more than courage. It required awareness, planning, and a willingness to accept that some situations are inherently risky. The experience changed me. I am no longer reckless in the wilderness. I respect isolation in a way I never did before. And I know that even in the calmest, most beautiful places, the world can feel dangerous when you are completely alone. When I finally look back at that trip, the fear is still vivid, but so is the clarity that I made it out safe. I did not rely on luck or fantasy. I relied on observation, preparedness, and vigilance. And that is what ultimately allowed me to leave the forest and return to life, whole and unharmed, with a story that I will never forget. I had been planning the trip for months. The idea of escaping the city, leaving behind the constant hum of traffic and the pressure of deadlines, had consumed my thoughts for weeks. I wanted a place far away from anyone else, somewhere isolated, where I could be alone and just exist without anyone telling me what to do or when to do it. That's how I found the cabin. It was small, older than I initially thought from the photos online, and hidden deep in the woods near the edge of a national forest. The listing had promised privacy, quiet, and a chance to be one with nature. None of that felt exaggerated when I drove down the narrow dirt road that ended at the cabin. The air smelled of pine, wet earth, and the faint smell of smoke from old chimneys. The cabin itself was simple, a single story with faded wooden panels, a small porch, and windows that reflected the green of the forest around it. The door creaked as I opened it, but it wasn't broken. It was the kind of creak that came from age, not damage. Inside, the cabin was dim, with dust on the floorboards and an unmistakable musty smell. It had a small kitchen area, a stove that still worked, and a wood-burning heater in the corner. I set my backpack down and immediately noticed the silence. It wasn't the peaceful kind I had imagined. It was heavier, thicker, like the air itself was holding its breath. Outside, the wind stirred the trees in a whisper, but inside, the air was still. I walked through the cabin, inspecting the space. Everything was basic but functional. The bed was firm but clean, the fridge hummed faintly, and there were enough dishes and cutlery for my stay. There was even a stack of firewood by the stove, neatly cut and ready. The first night, I lit the heater and a small oil lamp, sat at the table, and ate a simple dinner I had brought with me. I felt a strange mix of excitement and unease. The forest pressed in on every side, and the darkness outside the windows was so complete it almost seemed solid. I slept lightly, waking a few times to the sound of something brushing against the cabin. I told myself it was the wind, branches scraping against the siding, or maybe an animal passing by. I stayed awake longer than usual, staring at the shadows, until exhaustion finally overtook me. The next day, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. The forest was dense, full of towering pines and undergrowth so thick I had to push branches aside as I walked. The ground was damp, soft under my boots, and covered in a thick layer of needles. I noticed animal tracks in the mud. Deer, raccoons, maybe even a bear. I didn't see anything large, but the tracks made me aware that I wasn't entirely alone. I found a small stream not far from the cabin. the water clear and cold. I knelt down, washed my face, and filled my water bottle. The isolation was both calming and nerve-wracking. There was no cell service. My phone was essentially useless. The nearest road was miles away. If something went wrong, I was on my own. Back at the cabin, I spent the afternoon chopping firewood and tending to the stove. As the evening approached, clouds rolled in quickly, dark and heavy. The wind picked up. The forest seemed to change. It felt tighter, closer, as if the trees themselves were leaning in. I noticed how dark it became even before sunset. I closed the windows tightly and checked the locks. The wind howled against the cabin, rattling the glass, making the floorboards groan. I tried to ignore it and focus on dinner. Around midnight, the storm hit. Rain pounded the roof. The wind whistled through gaps in the wooden panels, and lightning split the sky. I lay in bed with the heater on, listening to the storm. That's when I noticed it. A sound from outside that didn't belong. At first, I thought it was part of the storm. A branch falling, perhaps, but it continued in a rhythm, deliberate, slow, like something was moving around the cabin. I held my breath, straining to hear over the rain. There was a scraping sound against the back wall, then a pause, then another scrape. I realized with a sinking feeling that it wasn't the wind. Something was outside. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag, my hands shaking. I turned it on and pointed it toward the window, but the beam was mostly swallowed by darkness and the rain. I shined it around the perimeter of the cabin from the porch. I saw nothing, only shadows dancing in the rain, distorted shapes of trees. But the sound continued. It moved from one side of the cabin to the other. Something was circling. My mind raced, imagining intruders, animals, anything. Fear settled in my chest, heavy and cold. I remembered the small axe I had brought for splitting firewood. I grabbed it and stayed in the center of the cabin, moving slowly from room to room, flashlight in one hand, axe in the other. I realized I had no way to call for help. My only option was to wait until morning or confront whatever was outside if it tried to enter. The storm continued, and I stayed on edge, listening to every snap of a branch, every drop of water hitting the roof. Hours passed. My mind created shapes from shadows, imagined figures at the windows. Sleep was impossible. By morning, the storm had subsided. The cabin was wet, and the ground outside was muddy and slippery. I stepped out cautiously, scanning the area. That's when I saw it. Footprints in the mud around the back of the cabin. They were large, heavy, and not human. Bear tracks. I felt a strange mix of relief and tension. Relief because it wasn't a person, but tension because bears were dangerous, especially if surprised or cornered. The sound last night had been the bear, likely trying to investigate the cabin for food. I realized how vulnerable I had been, alone with no escape. For the next few days, I stayed inside mostly, venturing out only when the storm had cleared. I moved firewood closer to the cabin, kept all food locked in containers, and learned to identify the signs of wildlife in the area. I watched tracks, scat, and broken branches. I realized how little I understood about surviving in such isolation. Each night, the darkness felt heavier, the sounds sharper, but I slowly gained a rhythm, learning the patterns of the forest, the ways the wind carried sound, and the signs that indicated a bear or other animal nearby. One afternoon, I noticed a large pile of rocks near the edge of the clearing, arranged in a way that didn't seem natural. I examined it carefully and realized it was probably a small rock slide, caused by water erosion. I also noticed other details. Claw marks on the wooden siding of the cabin, likely from the bear, scratches from branches where animals had moved through the trees. I documented everything in my notebook, a combination of fear and fascination keeping me alert. I began to understand that the forest wasn't empty. It was alive in ways I hadn't fully grasped before. Each creature, each sound, each movement mattered. The following days were tense but uneventful. I maintained routines, collecting firewood, checking the perimeter, keeping the stove going, and staying hydrated. I also spent time preparing a signal for help in case I needed it. I tied bright cloth to the tops of trees near the cabin and arranged logs and rocks in patterns visible from above. I realized that the isolation that had drawn me here was also a risk. I was entirely dependent on my own skills and judgment. One morning, I woke to the distant sound of a vehicle. I ran to the edge of the clearing and saw a park ranger's truck winding down the dirt road. Relief washed over me. I waved frantically, and the vehicle stopped near the cabin. The ranger checked in, listened to my story about the bear and the storm, and advised me on safety measures. He confirmed that this area was known for wildlife activity and that visitors often underestimated the danger. I felt a mix of pride and humility. I had survived, alone, relying on my observation, caution, and resourcefulness. I had learned the hard way how unpredictable and unforgiving the wilderness could be. Before leaving, I carefully inspected the cabin one last time. The scratches on the siding, the flattened grass where the bear had investigated, and the signs of the storm all told a story of resilience and survival. I packed my things methodically, secured the cabin as best as I could, and started the long drive back to civilization. As I left the dense forest behind, the quiet I felt was different now. It was not oppressive. It was respectful, a reminder that I had been a guest in a place that demanded attention and care. In the weeks after the trip, I reflected on every moment. The fear, the tension, the long nights listening to sounds in the dark. They had taught me patience, vigilance, and respect for nature. I knew I would never take isolation lightly again, nor underestimate the power of a storm, or the presence of animals that I might never see but whose tracks and sounds filled the forest. The cabin trip had been terrifying, exhausting, and utterly instructive. I had survived, and more than that, I had grown. I returned home with stories etched in memory, but also with a renewed sense of self-reliance and awareness that I carried into everyday life. The forest had tested me, but it had also shown me the value of careful observation, preparation, and humility. I had planned the trip for months, carefully researching a small, isolated cabin tucked deep in the forest. The cabin was old, built decades ago and off the grid, promised solitude and peace, which is what I wanted more than anything. The city had been suffocating me, its noise and lights constant, and I felt like I needed to disappear for a while, to breathe in silence and see the forest in its raw, untouched state. I had rented the place for a week, packed lightly but deliberately, with enough food, water, and supplies to last, and my backpack carried all the essentials, from a first aid kit to a flashlight with extra batteries. The drive to the cabin was long, winding through narrow roads lined with tall pines. The sun was beginning its descent when I finally turned onto the dirt path that led to the cabin. The tires crunched over loose stones and dry leaves, and I could feel my heartbeat quicken with both excitement and apprehension. The forest seemed quiet at first, almost too quiet. No birds sang, no squirrels ran along the branches, and even the wind seemed subdued, brushing through the trees with only the faintest whisper. I had read that silence in the forest could be deceiving, and now I understood why. When I arrived, the cabin looked exactly as it had in the pictures. It was small, made of weathered wood, with a sloping roof and a chimney that had long since stopped puffing smoke. The windows were dusty, some cracked, and the front porch sagged slightly under its own weight. I parked my car to the side and carried my backpack and small duffel bag to the porch, feeling the chill in the evening air. I unlocked the door, and it creaked loudly as I stepped inside. The smell of old wood, mildew, and dust hit me immediately, but it was not unpleasant. It had a raw, earthy scent that seemed fitting for a cabin in the middle of nowhere. Inside, the cabin was basic. A small kitchen area with a propane stove, a wooden table with 2 chairs, and a living space with a worn couch and a wood-burning stove. A narrow staircase led to a loft bedroom, and there was a bathroom with an old toilet and a small shower. Everything was functional, though the electricity had long since been disconnected, leaving me with only a couple of battery-operated lights and candles. I set down my things, unpacked enough to be comfortable, and lit a small fire in the stove, which cast flickering shadows across the room. The first night passed without incident. I ate a simple dinner, sat by the fire, and watched the shadows dance on the walls. I slept fitfully, though waking several times to every creak and groan of the old cabin. It was natural, I told myself, the way which shifts and contracts with temperature and wind. The next morning, I explored the area around the cabin. The forest was dense and the undergrowth thick, but a faint trail led away from the cabin and into the woods. I decided to follow it, carrying a backpack with water, a map, a compass, and my flashlight. I walked for hours, feeling a mixture of freedom and unease. The deeper I went, the quieter the forest became. Birds were nowhere to be seen, and even the rustling of leaves underfoot sounded amplified in the still air. I noticed broken branches and animal tracks, but nothing that suggested danger. By mid-afternoon, I had reached a small clearing with a pond, the water calm and reflective. I rested there for a while, feeling the tension in my body ease. Returning to the cabin, I noticed something odd. A small branch had been broken near the front door, as if someone or something had brushed against it. I shook my head, telling myself it was likely just the wind or a deer passing by. I locked the door carefully and spent the rest of the evening tidying up and preparing food. The night was darker than the previous one, with thick clouds obscuring the moon and stars. I lit candles, careful to place them in safe positions, and again slept fitfully, waking to the sound of footsteps outside. I told myself it was probably an animal. The third day was when things started to feel wrong. I went for a hike along the main trail, but the path seemed different somehow. It felt narrower, the trees closer together, and there were subtle signs that someone had been there recently. A footprint in soft soil, the faint smell of smoke, a branch snapped unnaturally. I brushed it off, blaming my nerves, but the unease grew. Returning to the cabin, I noticed the front door slightly ajar. My stomach dropped. I was sure I had locked it. The inside of the cabin showed no signs of being disturbed, but that small detail left my mind racing. I checked all windows and locks multiple times and stayed near the fire, watching the darkness outside. By the fourth day, the feeling of being watched had intensified. I spent most of the day inside, reading and doing small chores, but I constantly glanced at the windows. At dusk, I noticed a faint movement among the trees, just beyond the clearing. Figure, though I could not be sure. I told myself it was a trick of light and shadows, yet my hands shook slightly as I prepared dinner. That night, I could not sleep at all. Every sound, the wind, the groan of the cabin, the snapping of branches, made my heart race. I kept my flashlight within reach, and at one point, I thought I heard something scratching at the door. On the fifth day, I decided to confront the unease by leaving the cabin entirely and hiking to a nearby road I had seen on the map. I packed supplies for the day and set out early, sticking to the marked trails. The forest was still oppressive, the silence heavy, and I kept imagining shapes moving among the trees. Hours passed with nothing but trees, birds, and my own footsteps. Then, near a bend in the trail, I found fresh footprints in the mud, large and human-like. My stomach sank. They were too big to be mine, and there was no one else in sight. I turned back immediately, keeping the trail in sight, and returned to the cabin with a sense of urgency I had never felt before. That night, I did something I had never done in my life. I stayed awake, fully alert, crouched near the window with my flashlight ready. Hours passed. The wind howled, and branches scraped the sides of the cabin. I could hear my own breathing. Then, around midnight, I saw movement near the edge of the clearing. A person, dressed in dark clothing, crouched and moving carefully through the trees. My heart pounded. I considered leaving immediately, but I knew the car was vulnerable if they were waiting outside. I stayed put, quietly observing. The figure circled the cabin slowly, never coming closer than 30 feet, then finally disappeared into the trees. The next morning, I noticed something alarming. Footprints led from the edge of the clearing directly to the cabin and then away, looping around the back. It was clear someone had been near the cabin while I slept. My first instinct was panic, but I tried to remain rational. I reinforced the locks, placed furniture against doors, and gathered supplies. I knew I could not stay another night alone if whoever was outside returned. I decided to leave immediately, packing my backpack with essentials, leaving behind the comfort items I had brought. As I loaded my car, I noticed something carved into the porch railing, faint and rough, like a warning or a mark. I could not make out what it said, but it was enough to confirm that someone had been observing me for days. I started the car and drove slowly down the dirt path, scanning the trees constantly. Every snapping branch made me tense, but I did not stop until the cabin was far behind me. By mid-afternoon, I reached the main road, where I finally allowed myself to relax slightly. I drove to the nearest town, stopped at a store, and used a phone to call the authorities. I reported the incident, describing the footprints, the figure, and the cabin's isolation. They took the report seriously, though they could do little until they visited the site themselves. I stayed in town overnight, feeling the tension gradually drain from my body, though I knew it would take weeks for the fear to fully fade. A week later, the authorities investigated the cabin. They found signs that someone had been living nearby in a makeshift shelter, moving silently through the forest to observe the cabin. The marks on the porch were consistent with a person trying to intimidate or warn intruders away. There were no weapons, no confrontation had occurred, but the potential for danger had been real and immediate. I realized that if I had stayed another night, I could have encountered this person alone, unarmed, and trapped in the cabin. The experience left me changed. I understood the fragility of safety in isolation, the way human threats can be as frightening, if not more so, than any imagined supernatural presence. I never returned to that cabin, and I do not think I will ever go back to such isolation alone. But I learned the importance of preparation, vigilance, and trusting one's instincts. That forest, once a promise of peace, had become a lesson in caution and survival. Now, months later, I still replay the trip in my mind. The sights, the sounds, the moments of fear, they are all vivid. I do not dwell on them in a way that consumes me, but I do carry the memory as a reminder. Even in places that seem untouched and calm, danger can be very real, and it often comes from unexpected, human sources. I have since hiked and camped in other places, but always with more awareness, always with a plan for escape, and always with the understanding that solitude, while tempting, can be perilous when someone else is lurking just beyond your sight. The cabin remains in my memory, a place of both fascination and fear, a place where I faced uncertainty, terror, and ultimately relief. The ending was clear, the danger avoided, but the experience stayed with me, shaping the way I approach solitude, nature, and the unpredictable presence of others. I had been looking forward to a few days alone in the cabin for months. Work had been exhausting, life had been noisy, and I craved silence the way a dehydrated person craves water. The cabin itself was tucked deep in the woods, far enough from the nearest road that the GPS on my phone only vaguely knew where I was. It had been a small, wooden structure, weathered by decades of wind and rain, with a steep roof that sagged slightly in the middle and windows clouded with dust and the remnants of old rainwater streaks. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, a smell that made me feel like I had stepped back in time. I had driven for hours, along narrow, winding dirt roads, my car bouncing over rocks and potholes that I hadn't noticed on the map. The sun was just dipping behind the trees when I finally reached the small clearing where the cabin sat. It was quiet, almost oppressively so. No birds, no wind, no sound other than the faint hum of insects. I parked my car beside a pile of split firewood stacked against the side of the cabin and got out, feeling the crisp chill in the air that had already begun to settle. The smell of damp wood was stronger up close, and I noticed the small cracks in the walls where the wood had warped over time. The front door creaked as I opened it, a sound that seemed loud in the otherwise silent clearing. Inside, the cabin was small but functional. There was a wood stove in the corner, a couple of shelves lined with dust-covered cans and jars, and a narrow bed pushed up against the far wall. A small table and a chair completed the room. The floorboards groaned under my weight as I stepped in, and the smell of mildew mixed with old smoke hit me. It wasn't unpleasant, just old, like the cabin had been waiting for someone to come back. I set my backpack down and lit a small lamp that I had brought. Its warm, flickering light barely pushed back the shadows that crowded the corners of the room. The first night was peaceful. I made a small fire in the stove and sat watching the flames dance across the walls. Outside, I could hear the occasional rustle of something moving in the underbrush, but it felt distant, normal for a place like this. I slept fitfully, my mind half watching through the darkness, but I told myself it was just the wilderness being alive. The next morning, I decided to explore the surrounding woods. The cabin had a narrow trail leading deeper into the forest, overgrown with roots and fallen branches. I followed it, noticing how the sunlight struggled to reach the ground through the thick canopy above. Birds had started to sing, and I felt a small sense of relief. At least today, the world seemed alive. As I walked, I spotted a few deer tracks in the mud, fresh enough that I knew the animals had been there recently. It made me feel like I was part of something much larger, something raw and unpolished. When I returned to the cabin that afternoon, I noticed something I hadn't before. One of the windows was slightly ajar, just enough that a breeze could slip through. I was sure I had closed all the windows the night before. I stepped closer, examining the lock and the frame. It was old, a little brittle, but it looked intact. Still, the window was open. I shrugged it off as maybe having been loose for years and just moved by the wind. I closed it carefully and pressed my hands against the frame, listening for any sound. Nothing. That night, things started to feel different. The forest was louder, the noises closer. Every snap of a branch or rustle of leaves made me tense. I tried to ignore it, sitting by the fire with a book, but my mind kept drifting to that open window. I checked it several times, each time making sure it was locked. Eventually, I fell asleep, exhausted. Around 3 in the morning, I woke suddenly to the sound of something scraping against the side of the cabin. It was slow, deliberate, like nails or a stick dragging against the wood. My heart slammed in my chest. I froze, listening. The sound stopped, then started again a moment later, moving across the side of the building. I gripped my flashlight and slowly got out of bed, trying to see through the darkness. The beam of the light sliced through the shadows outside. There was nothing. Not a deer, not a raccoon, nothing at all. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was a branch, the wind, some animal. But as I turned to go back to bed, I heard it again, this time from the back of the cabin. Slow, heavy dragging sounds. My pulse was so loud I thought it would betray me. I considered calling for help, but I didn't have reception. I realized then that I hadn't seen another car on the road since I arrived. Not a single person. If something was out there, I was alone, truly alone. I stayed up the rest of the night, huddled in a corner with the flashlight and a small hatchet I had packed for firewood. The sounds continued intermittently, close enough that I could feel the vibration through the floorboards. Every time I thought it had stopped, it would start again, closer this time, moving around the cabin. I didn't sleep a wink. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay in the cabin like that. I needed to see if someone else was nearby or if I could get out. I packed some water and food into a backpack and stepped outside. The forest was quiet now, almost eerily so. I checked the perimeter of the cabin, walking around slowly, trying to see if there were footprints or signs of anyone else. That's when I noticed them. Footprints. Not deer, not raccoon. Human. Bare, small and fresh, leading around the back of the cabin and disappearing into the trees. Panic started to set in, but I forced myself to stay calm. I retraced my steps, following the trail, moving slowly and quietly. It was hard to tell how far the person had gone, but the tracks were recent enough that they couldn't have gone far. I circled back to the cabin, checking the windows and doors again. Everything seemed normal, nothing out of place except the footprints. I decided then that I would stay in the cabin until morning and make a run for the road if the intruder didn't show themselves. That night, I tried to barricade the doors and windows as best I could. I moved the table in front of the door and stacked firewood against it, wedging pieces of furniture in any gap I could find. My heart raced constantly. Around midnight, the noises started again. Slow, deliberate steps circling the cabin, scratching at the walls, soft thumps against the windows. I gripped the hatchet, listening to every sound. This time, though, I noticed a pattern. The noises moved around the cabin, stopping occasionally as if someone was inspecting it. Then it would start again. I couldn't stay hidden forever. I realized I had to act before the person broke in. I remembered the small stream a few hundred meters down the trail. If I could reach it, I might be able to follow it to the main road, where someone could see me. I waited until the sounds faded slightly, then moved as quietly as I could, backpack on my shoulders, hatchet in hand. My steps were careful, slow, trying not to snap any twigs or make noise. As I approached the stream, I heard the sound again, behind me this time, a branch snapping under weight, soft footsteps in the dirt. My heart jumped. I ran, faster than I had in years, branches scratching my face and arms. The sounds followed, keeping pace with me. I ran until I reached the stream, then followed it, jumping over roots and rocks, wading through shallow water, my lungs burning. The footsteps disappeared. By the time dawn broke, I stumbled onto a gravel road. A logging truck passed by and I flagged it down. The driver stopped, eyes wide at the state I was in. I didn't explain much, just asked to be taken to the nearest town. The relief of seeing people again was overwhelming. I called the local authorities and told them about the cabin and the footprints. Later, the sheriff explained that the cabin had been abandoned for years, but occasionally someone had been squatting nearby. They suspected a transient who liked to observe campers before deciding whether to approach or stay hidden. They said it wasn't unusual for people to be living in the woods like that, though most avoided contact. The sheriff had checked the area around the cabin, but the person had vanished. I never went back to that cabin. The memory of those footsteps circling the walls, the scratching, and the quiet, patient presence of someone unseen stayed with me. I learned, in the most frightening way, that isolation can be dangerous, not because of ghosts or fairy tales, but because sometimes the threat is human, waiting and watching. I eventually found another cabin for solitude, one closer to a road, one where help wasn't hours away. The forest felt different after that, alive but unpredictable, a place where you have to respect not just nature, but other people who might be hidden among the trees. I still think about it often, the way the cabin sat in that clearing, waiting, and how close I came to never leaving. The details of those nights are burned into my memory. The smell of the wood, the sounds outside, the feeling of being watched. And I know now that when you're alone in the wilderness, the scariest things aren't always what you imagine. They're the things you can't see. I had been planning this trip for months, craving the silence and isolation of the mountains. The city had begun to feel like a weight pressing down on me, and I needed space to breathe, space where no one would intrude and nothing would demand my attention. I had rented a small cabin deep in the forest, far from the nearest town. It was the kind of place where cell service barely existed, and the only sounds were the wind in the trees and the distant calls of birds. The kind of place where you could hear yourself think, or worse, hear yourself too clearly. The drive there had taken longer than I expected. The road wound through narrow passes, and the trees leaned so close to the edges I sometimes felt like they would sweep the car off the road if I wasn't careful. I arrived in late afternoon, the sun low and orange, filtering through the pines in long streaks. The cabin was smaller than I imagined from the pictures, just a wooden box with a steep roof and a small porch. But it was solid, with shutters on the windows and a woodpile stacked neatly by the door. The air smelled of damp earth and pine resin, sharp and clean. It was quiet, almost unnervingly so. I spent the first hour unpacking, carrying my bag inside and setting down the few supplies I had brought. The interior smelled faintly of cedar and old blankets. There was a small kitchen, a single room with a wood stove, a bed in the corner, and a bathroom that looked like it hadn't been used in years. I lit a fire in the stove, the smell of burning wood filling the cabin, and felt a small sense of accomplishment. I had made it here alone. No one to bother me, no responsibilities, no expectations. Just me and the forest. The first night was uneventful. I ate a simple dinner, read a book by the fire, and fell asleep to the sound of wind moving through the trees. When I woke in the morning, the forest was misted with fog, the kind that clings to everything and makes distance seem impossible to measure. I decided to take a walk, curious about the surroundings. The cabin had a faint path leading into the woods, worn by previous visitors, and I followed it, stepping over roots and fallen branches. The air was damp, the fog thick enough that I could barely see 20 feet ahead. The forest seemed enormous, and even though I knew logically it was just a collection of trees and underbrush, I felt tiny and vulnerable. As I walked, I noticed signs of wildlife. Tracks in the mud, small piles of scat, chewed pine cones, but nothing dangerous. The peace of the forest was deceptive. Even though I was alone, I didn't feel lonely. I felt watched, not by a person, but by the forest itself, as if every shadow held movement I couldn't see. My steps slowed instinctively, ears straining for every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves. It was exhilarating and terrifying at the same time. When I returned to the cabin, the fog had lifted slightly, leaving the air crisp and cold. I cooked a simple lunch and spent the afternoon tidying the cabin, stacking more wood for the stove, checking the windows and doors. By late afternoon, the sky had turned gray, heavy with clouds that promised rain. I could hear the wind picking up outside, rattling the shutters. I went to bed early, expecting a restless night, but sleep came easily, lulled by the monotone sound of the wind. The next day, the weather had turned worse than I expected. Rain fell in sheets, drumming on the roof and running in rivulets down the sides of the cabin. I stayed inside, reading and tending the fire. I noticed that the woods outside looked darker and more oppressive, the fog mixing with the rain to create an almost solid wall of gray. I felt a strange tension growing, a sense that the world beyond my small walls was unpredictable and not entirely under my control. Around mid-afternoon, I heard a noise outside that made me freeze. At first, I thought it was the wind, a snapping branch or a piece of debris. But then it came again, a heavier sound, deliberate, like someone stepping through the wet underbrush. My stomach tightened. The forest was thick and no one should be out there. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer or a moose, maybe even a bear, but the rhythm of the steps felt different. Slower, heavier, moving with purpose. I moved quietly to the window, careful not to make a sound. The rain blurred my vision, but I could make out shapes moving between the trees. There was no one visible, just dark, shifting forms, but the sense of being watched intensified. My hands shook as I fumbled with the shutters, closing them more tightly. I checked the locks on the doors, even though I had locked them already. The logical part of my mind said it was fine, that I was overreacting, but my body refused to relax. My heart hammered in my chest, every thump echoing in the small cabin. Hours passed. The storm worsened. Rain splashed against the windows, wind moaning through the eaves. I could hear something scraping at the outside walls, subtle at first, then more insistent. My mind raced with possibilities, none comforting. Someone could be out there, following me. Or maybe it was an animal trapped close to the cabin, trying to get inside. The uncertainty was unbearable. I stayed awake, sitting close to the stove, the fire my only source of warmth and light. By the next morning, the rain had stopped, leaving a damp, heavy fog. I forced myself to leave the cabin, checking the perimeter. The ground was churned and wet, and I saw footprints leading away from the cabin, large and uneven. They were not animal prints, I realized with a sick twist in my stomach. They were human. I traced them carefully, following them as far as I could, but the forest swallowed them quickly, and I lost the trail. My hands were cold, my body tense, and for the first time I felt real fear, the kind that is quiet and deep, a pressure in your chest that makes thinking hard. I spent the next day in a state of hyper-awareness. Every sound was magnified. Every shadow seemed alive. I avoided the windows, only venturing outside for brief periods to gather firewood. I set up small barricades at the doors with chairs and logs, just in case. Sleep was impossible. The fear clung to me. Night fell, and I heard the movement again, deliberate, methodical, circling the cabin. I did not dare look outside. I could only listen and wait. The storm returned that night, heavier than before, wind shrieking through the trees, rain hammering the roof. I stayed awake, tense and vigilant, fearing that someone or something was outside. I considered leaving, but the road back to civilization was treacherous, washed out in places by the rain. I had no choice but to wait until daylight. Morning arrived slowly. The rain had stopped, and the forest was quiet, almost oppressively so. I cautiously opened the door, peering outside. The footprints were still there, leading away from the cabin into the deeper woods. I followed them at a distance, staying low, keeping cover behind trees and shrubs. The trail led me through dense underbrush, over small creeks, and finally to a clearing. There, I saw signs of a campsite recently abandoned, an overturned tent, a small fire pit with cold ashes. No people were present. I searched the area carefully, looking for anything left behind. There were a few scraps of food, a water bottle, and a backpack. Nothing that identified anyone. The realization hit me slowly. Whoever had been near my cabin had fled, possibly after realizing I was inside, possibly for another reason I could not know. The fear that had gripped me for days began to recede, replaced by exhaustion. I was alive. I had survived the ordeal. I returned to the cabin, cautious but relieved. I packed my things, checking every corner, making sure nothing was out of place. The forest felt different now, less threatening, but I did not linger. I left as quickly as I could, driving carefully down the winding roads, the memory of the fear still fresh in my mind. By the time I reached the nearest town, sunlight was falling across the mountains, warm and reassuring. I checked into a small motel, exhausted, and finally allowed myself to relax. Over the following days, I reflected on the experience. The isolation had been intoxicating but also dangerous. The forest was indifferent to human presence. It did not care who walked its paths. I realized that fear could be both paralyzing and protective. I learned the importance of preparation, awareness, and caution. Most importantly, I understood that survival sometimes depended not on bravery, but on patience and observation, on knowing when to act and when to wait. In the end, I left the mountains behind, carrying with me the memory of the cabin, the storm, and the sense of being watched. The experience changed me, made me more cautious but also more attuned to the world around me. I returned to the city, but the forest never left my mind. Even now, years later, I can close my eyes and remember the damp air, the smell of wet pine, the sound of rain on the roof, and the uneasy feeling of knowing that someone, or something, was out there, just beyond my sight. I survived, and the clarity of that survival was a lesson I would never forget. I had been planning the cabin trip for months. I wanted to get away from everything. My job, the city noise, and the constant pressure of life. I found a small cabin tucked deep in the forest, far from the nearest town. The pictures online made it look peaceful, a little rustic, but the perfect escape. It was early October when I drove up, the air sharp and cold, the leaves just starting to turn gold and red. The road to the cabin was rough, mostly dirt and gravel, winding through the dense woods. My car rattled along, and I had to take it slow to avoid losing control on the steep patches. I kept thinking about the solitude I would have, how good it would be to finally be alone, without any interruptions, no calls, no emails. When I arrived, the cabin was just as the pictures had promised. It was small, with wood siding weathered from years of wind and rain, but the roof looked solid, and the windows were intact. There was a single chimney, a small porch with a wooden railing, and a stack of firewood neatly piled against the side. I parked my car in the small clearing in front and stepped out. The air was crisp, and the smell of pine was strong. I could hear the wind moving through the trees, low and constant, and the occasional crack of a distant branch snapping under its weight. I unloaded my bag, taking my essentials first: clothes, a sleeping bag, some food, and a few supplies like a lantern, extra batteries, and a small first aid kit. The cabin smelled faintly of dust and damp wood. I opened the windows to air it out and set up my sleeping area in the small room that had a bed, a tiny dresser, and a nightstand. The main room had a wood stove, a table with 2 chairs, and a small kitchenette with a gas stove and a sink. There was a bathroom in the back with cold running water from a well. I lit a fire in the stove, the flames crackling and throwing shadows against the walls. It felt warm, comforting, and safe. That first day, I explored the immediate area around the cabin. The trees were dense, mostly pines and oaks, and the ground was littered with leaves and broken branches. There was a small path leading down toward what seemed like a creek in the distance, the sound of running water faint but constant. I walked as far as I could safely go before it started getting late, then returned to the cabin. By the time I got back, the sun was low, the sky a dull orange, fading to gray. I lit more wood in the stove, made a simple dinner, and settled in for the night. That night, the wind had picked up. It rattled the windows and shook the old wooden structure. Every so often, I thought I heard something else. A distant snap, maybe an animal moving in the underbrush, but I tried to ignore it. I had brought a flashlight, and I had checked that all the locks on the doors and windows worked. I told myself I was being paranoid. The forest was full of life, especially at night, and sounds carried in strange ways. I eventually fell asleep to the steady whistle of the wind through the trees. The next morning, I woke to silence. The wind had died down, and the sunlight streamed through the windows. I made coffee on the small gas stove and stepped outside to breathe in the crisp air. It felt good, clean, almost like it washed away the stress of the city. I decided to hike along the path that led down to the creek. I wanted to see how far it went, maybe follow it for a while. The trail was narrow, overgrown in some spots, and uneven. I had to be careful not to twist an ankle on the rocks or roots. The creek was small but clear, the water running over smooth stones. I followed it for a while, taking in the colors of the leaves, the sunlight flickering through the canopy. I noticed animal tracks in the mud. Small deer prints, maybe a fox, but nothing alarming. Still, I stayed alert. I had packed a small knife and a whistle just in case. When I returned to the cabin in the late afternoon, I noticed something odd. The firewood pile I had stacked neatly yesterday was slightly disturbed. Some logs had rolled a little, one was even lying on the ground a few feet away. I froze, looking around. The clearing was empty, and there were no other tracks except mine from earlier. Maybe an animal had wandered by. It made sense. Bears and raccoons were known to explore areas like this. I didn't want to overreact, so I rearranged the firewood, making sure everything was as secure as possible. That night, the wind returned, stronger this time. It howled through the trees and pressed against the cabin walls. I sat by the stove, the light casting long shadows in the room, feeling a little tense. Around midnight, I heard it, a soft but deliberate knock on the cabin door. My heart jumped. I froze, listening. Nothing followed. I told myself it must be a branch tapping in the wind, but the sound was too precise, too direct. I crept to the door and peered through the small window. The clearing was empty. I didn't see movement, no shadows. I double-checked the locks and bolted the door. Sleep was difficult after that. Every little sound, the wind, a branch scraping, a distant animal call, made me tense. I kept imagining someone outside, just standing and watching, waiting. My mind ran wild. I thought about leaving, but the nearest town was over an hour away, and I had driven all this way to get away from people. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was probably an animal. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been here. The next morning, I went outside to inspect. There were footprints near the cabin, shallow but visible in the soft dirt. They weren't mine. They were small, human, and they led around the side of the cabin and then back into the woods. I felt a chill run down my spine. Someone had been here. I quickly checked all the windows and doors. They were still locked, no signs of forced entry. Whoever it was hadn't tried to break in, at least not yet. I realized I had to be careful. I couldn't confront whoever it was, not without knowing what they wanted. I spent the next day securing the cabin as best as I could. I moved some chairs to block the windows, piled heavy items near doors, and made sure my knife and flashlight were always within reach. I avoided going far from the cabin. I watched the edge of the woods constantly, trying to spot movement, listening for any sound that didn't belong. The feeling of being watched never left me. I didn't see anyone, but I knew the prints were real, and I knew someone had been here. Night came again. I sat in the corner of the cabin, near the stove, listening to the wind and the occasional rustle of the trees. Around 11, I heard it again, the knock on the door. Louder this time. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound. Came again, slow, deliberate. I gripped my knife and flashlight, and for a long minute, nothing else happened. Then I heard another sound. Footsteps moving around the side of the cabin, crunching leaves and breaking small branches. Someone was circling the building. My heart pounded. I wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. The windows were small and high, the doors locked. I stayed quiet, hoping whoever it was would leave. The footsteps stopped after a few minutes, then silence returned. I waited another hour before I dared move. The next morning, I called the local ranger station from my cell phone. The signal was weak, but I managed to speak with someone and explain the situation. They said they would send someone to check the area, but it might take several hours. I stayed inside, doors locked, watching the edge of the woods. The forest that had seemed so peaceful the day before now felt menacing, alive in a way I didn't like. By late afternoon, a ranger arrived. A man in uniform with a truck and a calm but serious demeanor. He looked around the cabin, inspected the disturbed firewood and the tracks. He confirmed that the prints were human and that someone had definitely been around recently. He asked if I had seen anyone. I shook my head. He explained that in remote areas like this, people sometimes try to camp illegally, or worse, they watch cabins like mine looking for a chance to break in. He suggested I pack my things and stay with him until it was safe. I agreed immediately. I left the cabin that evening, riding in the ranger's truck as he drove slowly down the forest road. I looked back once, the cabin shrinking in the distance, surrounded by trees that now seemed threatening rather than beautiful. I felt a mix of relief and sadness. Relief that I was safe, and sadness that my quiet escape had turned into fear. I had wanted solitude, but I hadn't realized how vulnerable that could make me. In the following days, I stayed in town, working with the rangers to report the incident. They kept watch on the cabin and eventually found signs of someone else trying to break in again. It was clear that I had been lucky to notice the first signs and call for help. I realized how easily things could have gone wrong. I never went back to that cabin alone. I understood now that isolation has its dangers, that the forest can hide people as easily as it hides animals. The experience left me shaken but wiser, more cautious. Months later, I found another cabin trip, but this time I went with friends. We kept close together, never wandering far, always checking our surroundings. The fear I felt alone in that remote cabin stayed with me, a constant reminder that even in the quietest, most peaceful places, danger can exist, and it's not always visible. I learned to respect the solitude of nature, but I also learned to respect my own limits, my own safety. And in that, there was a kind of peace I had never expected to find. I had been planning the cabin trip for months. The idea of being alone in the woods, away from anyone and anything, sounded perfect. I had grown tired of the constant noise in the city, the cars, the people, the endless chatter. I wanted quiet, real quiet, where I could hear my own thoughts clearly, where the only sounds would be the wind through the trees, the birds in the morning, and maybe the occasional rustle of some small animal. I had found a cabin listed online, far from any town, far from any road. The owner had said it was accessible by a single dirt trail, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. That was exactly what I wanted. I drove for hours, through winding mountain roads and narrow passes, the sun getting lower and lower as I climbed higher into the hills. The dirt road to the cabin was rough, and at times I had to crawl over rocks or push the car through loose gravel, but eventually, I saw it. A small wooden cabin, dark and weathered, surrounded by dense trees and underbrush. Smoke curled lazily from the stone chimney. I parked in the tiny clearing, grabbed my bag, and walked up the narrow path to the front door. The cabin was simple. A single room with a small kitchen area, a wood stove, and a loft where the bed was. Everything smelled faintly of wood smoke and old pine, and the floorboards creaked under my weight. I unpacked my things slowly, deliberately, feeling the quiet sink into me like a heavy blanket. Outside, the sun was setting behind the ridges, casting long shadows across the forest. I built a small fire in the stove, the warmth and smell comforting, and settled into the worn armchair to read a book I had brought. The first night was peaceful. The wind whispered through the trees, and I fell asleep to the rhythm of it. In the morning, I woke early, the air cold and crisp. I opened the cabin door to step outside and was struck by the sheer quiet of the place. No cars, no voices, nothing but the sound of my own boots crunching on the frosty leaves. I explored a bit, walking the narrow trail around the cabin, noting the small creek nearby and the rocky outcrop that overlooked the valley. It was beautiful, and I felt a sense of isolation that I had been craving. The next day, I settled into a routine. I chopped wood, made breakfast over the stove, and walked along the trail, keeping careful note of landmarks so I could always find my way back. Everything seemed normal, serene even. But by the third day, I noticed small things that unsettled me. Footprints in the soft mud near the edge of the clearing. They were human, small, like someone had been walking around the cabin during the night. My first thought was that it might be an animal track or a trick of the mud. But no, the shape was unmistakable. I checked my supplies and locks, everything in place. I chalked it up to hikers passing through, although I had not seen a single car or person on the way in. That night, I stayed awake longer than usual. The fire in the stove crackled, and I listened. Every sound seemed amplified. The wind brushing against the cabin walls, the creak of the roof as it settled, a distant bird calling. But there was something else. Faint snap like a branch breaking. I paused, ears straining, convinced it was nothing, yet unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched. I went to the window and looked out. The moon had risen, casting a dim glow on the forest. Shadows moved, shifting in the corner of my vision. I told myself I was imagining it and went back to bed. The next morning, the footprints were closer to the cabin. I stepped outside cautiously, boots crunching on the frosty earth. The tracks led from the tree line right up to the cabin, then disappeared. There was no evidence anyone had been inside. No broken windows, nothing stolen. Still, I felt a cold awareness crawling up my spine. Someone or something had been near me. I decided to stay alert, but I also reminded myself that the forest could play tricks on the eyes and mind. Days passed, each one heavier than the last. The footprints returned each morning, sometimes closer, sometimes farther into the trees. At first, I considered leaving, but the cabin was isolated in a way that I had never experienced before, and I was drawn to it, almost unwilling to go back to the crowded world. I installed simple barriers. I moved furniture in front of doors. I tied lengths of rope across windows. I kept the fire going longer into the night. My nerves were stretched, but I tried to rationalize everything. Perhaps it was a local hunter or someone passing through. By the fifth night, I noticed something new. The footprints were paired, as if two people had been there. One set smaller, one larger. That knowledge made me anxious beyond anything I had felt before. I stayed up all night, watching the shadows from the loft. I kept the stove fire burning, even when it was low, because the light felt like a defense. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the walls. The shadows of the trees stretched unnaturally long across the clearing. And then I heard it, a soft crunching, deliberate, moving closer to the cabin. My heart hammered. I stayed still, every muscle tense, watching. The sound stopped near the door. I held my breath. Minutes passed, maybe longer. Then another snap, this time near the side window. I dared not move. The presence was palpable. The silence between movements filled with intent. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios. Burglary, confrontation, being trapped. I grabbed the heaviest object I had, a cast-iron skillet, and crept toward the loft stairs, keeping my eyes on the dimly lit windows. The sounds continued sporadically for hours, the unknown presence moving around the cabin perimeter. Sleep was impossible. Morning finally came. I forced myself outside, surveying the area. The tracks were unmistakable. leading from the tree line up to my cabin, circling it, and retreating. There was no sign of how many people, only that they had been thorough, methodical. I knew then that this was no casual hiker or passerby. Someone was aware of my presence and paying attention to my cabin. I packed my things hurriedly, my heart racing, and left the cabin in daylight. Driving down the dirt trail, I felt eyes on me, a tension that refused to release. I arrived at the nearest town hours later, grateful for the presence of others, for lights and walls and the constant noise I had once tried to escape. Despite the terror, I didn't report it immediately. Part of me feared being ridiculed, another part feared drawing more attention. But I realized later, after researching, that isolated cabins like mine were often noted by people seeking shelter, supplies, or opportunities for petty crime. I had been lucky, the tracks and sounds a warning rather than an attack. In the days that followed, I contacted the cabin owner and shared the experience. He confirmed that local authorities had records of transient individuals in the area, people who watched cabins for days to see if they were empty or occupied. Weeks later, I returned to the cabin, this time with friends, bringing supplies and checking the surroundings carefully. We installed secure locks, motion-sensitive lights, and cameras, taking precautions to ensure that any future visitors were known. The fear never entirely left me, but over time, the cabin became a place of controlled solitude rather than anxiety. I learned to respect the isolation, to take it seriously, and to prepare for it properly. Looking back, I realized that the true terror wasn't some supernatural force. It was the vulnerability of being alone, exposed, and unprepared. It was the uncertainty of another human being watching you, moving unseen, and testing your awareness. That knowledge stayed with me, but so did the lesson. Solitude has power, but it demands respect, vigilance, and preparation. The cabin, once a symbol of escape, became a symbol of awareness, of the careful balance between desire for peace and the realities of being alone in the wilderness. I returned to the city eventually, carrying with me the memory of the forest and the cabin. The fear never entirely left, but it was tempered by knowledge, preparation, and experience. I no longer sought isolation blindly. Now, I approached it cautiously, respecting the unknown and the human element that could turn serene wilderness into a place of danger. I had planned the trip for months. The cabin was deep in the forest, miles away from the nearest road, far enough that cell service barely reached even the edge of the property. I had been craving a break from everything, the constant noise of the city, the traffic, the people, the work emails that never stopped. I wanted silence. I wanted the kind of isolation that forced you to notice every sound, every smell, every movement around you. The place I rented was small, nothing fancy. A single wooden structure with a stone fireplace, a kitchen with basic appliances, a lofted bedroom, and a small bathroom. From what I had read online, it had electricity and running water, but the nearest store was 20 miles away, so I packed as if I wouldn't see civilization for at least a week. The drive there was long. I left early in the morning and drove through winding mountain roads, past dense trees and streams that cut across the asphalt in small, shallow bridges. At first, the forest felt alive in a calm, peaceful way. The sunlight glinting through the pine needles, birds calling to one another, the occasional deer grazing near the roadside. But as I went further, the feeling shifted. The trees seemed older, denser, and the road narrower, until finally, the asphalt ended and turned into a rough gravel path. I had to slow down, carefully navigating ruts and rocks. By the time I pulled up in front of the cabin, the sun was just beginning to dip below the ridges, and the shadows of the trees were long and dark. The cabin looked smaller than I imagined. Its wood had darkened over time, the roof sagging slightly in the middle. I parked and stepped out, taking a deep breath of the sharp, cold air. I could smell pine, dirt, and something faintly metallic. I shrugged it off, thinking it was probably the nearby creek. I carried my backpack and supplies inside, noting that the cabin smelled of old wood and dust. The windows were dusty, but the interior was clean enough, though the furniture was sparse. A small table, 2 chairs, a couch that looked like it had seen better days. I set down my things and began unpacking, placing food in the small fridge, unrolling my sleeping bag on the loft bed, and checking the fireplace to see if it would light easily. As night fell, I built a fire. I had brought wood from home because the online listing had said firewood was not provided. Sparks leapt from the grate as I coaxed the fire to life. The warm glow filled the cabin, and I felt a little safer, a little more comfortable. I ate a simple dinner of canned soup and bread, drinking slowly from a water bottle. Outside, the wind had picked up. It rustled the trees in a low, continuous moan. I could hear the creek nearby, the water running over rocks, louder than it had been in the daylight. It was peaceful, almost comforting. I thought about going to bed early, but I was restless. I wandered to the small porch outside, standing and listening. The forest was alive with sounds I didn't usually notice. The snap of branches, the distant call of an owl, the skitter of small animals over dry leaves. I reminded myself that being alone in the wilderness meant noticing things I wouldn't hear at home. That was all. I went to bed later than I expected, but sleep didn't come easily. The sounds outside were constant. Every creak of a branch, every rustle of leaves made me tense. I told myself I was imagining things, that the mind plays tricks in silence. At some point, I heard something different, a soft crunch, like a footstep on gravel, outside the cabin. My heart jumped. I froze, straining to hear. The fire in the fireplace had burned low, casting flickering shadows across the walls. I thought about looking through the window, but it was too dark, and I didn't want to give away my presence if someone was out there. I waited. The sound didn't come again. Maybe it had been the wind, I thought. Maybe an animal. I told myself these things over and over until sleep finally took me. The next morning, I woke to find the sky gray, heavy with clouds. A light drizzle was falling, tapping against the roof and the windows. I made coffee on the small gas stove and sat at the table, looking outside. The forest looked different in the mist, dense, dark, and even more isolated. I decided I would stay in today, read my book, and explore only in daylight. I noticed, though, that the gravel path leading to the cabin seemed disturbed. Not like a car had driven over it recently, but footprints, bare, deep in the wet gravel. They led up to the cabin, stopped at the porch, and then disappeared. My stomach tightened. Maybe a hiker had passed by last night, I told myself. Maybe someone had come to the cabin by mistake. I checked the locks, doors were secure. Windows were closed. I tried to shake it off, but unease settled in my chest like a heavy stone. I spent the day inside, pacing between the loft and the living area, glancing occasionally out the window at the gray forest. The rain never stopped, turning the dirt around the cabin into thick mud. The creek had grown louder, more forceful, carrying debris in the current. I started to notice small details. Twigs pressed against the windows in ways they shouldn't have been. A scuff on the porch railing I hadn't seen before. Every sound made me jump. The wind, the trees, a distant animal call. I kept imagining shapes moving between the trunks. Hours passed slowly. I ate, drank coffee, tried to distract myself with reading, but I could not shake the feeling of being watched. By evening, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. I decided to check the perimeter of the cabin. I stepped outside, wearing a waterproof jacket, and walked around the structure. I kept my flashlight ready, shining it over the ground. That's when I saw it. Footprints again, but this time around the back, leading into the dense forest. They were not small, not human-like in proportion, but they were definitely human. Barefoot, deep in the mud. My pulse jumped. Whoever it was had come close. I couldn't see anything beyond the first few steps into the trees. I went back inside quickly, locking doors and windows again. The rest of the night, I sat by the fire, constantly listening, eyes on the front window. I didn't sleep much. Every time the wind shifted, every time I thought I heard something moving outside, I flinched. The next morning, I decided I needed to leave. I could not handle the fear. I packed quickly, double-checked my supplies, and stepped outside. That's when I saw tracks in the gravel that hadn't been there the day before. footprints leading from the forest to the cabin and back, forming a rough circle, as if someone had been watching me sleep. I froze. My first thought was to get in the car and drive straight to the main road, but then I noticed something else. A stick had been placed against the cabin wall near the porch, not naturally fallen, and there was a small pile of leaves and dirt disturbed near the side window. My stomach turned over. I realized with absolute clarity that someone had been outside the cabin at night, possibly watching me. The thought of confronting them or them confronting me was unbearable. I got in the car, locked the doors, and started the engine, scanning the tree-line as I slowly backed down the gravel path. Every branch that snapped under the tires sounded like a warning. I drove slowly at first, but after a few minutes, I picked up speed. The forest seemed endless. For the first time, the isolation felt terrifying. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone emerging from the trees, following me. But there was nothing, only the wet, dark road stretching behind me. When I finally reached the asphalt, I breathed a long, shaky sigh. The main road was clear. I drove straight to the nearest gas station, bought a sandwich and a bottle of water, and sat in the car for a long time, feeling the tension in my body slowly release. I called a friend to tell them where I had been and what had happened. Talking, even over the phone, brought a small comfort, a reminder that the world outside the forest still existed. Later that day, I reported what I had seen, the footprints, the disturbed area, everything, to the local authorities. They noted it down, saying the area was remote and that trespassing occasionally happened, though it was rare. I went home the next day, exhausted and emotionally drained, but relieved to be in a familiar, populated place. The memory of the cabin stayed with me, though, the quiet, the isolation, the feeling of being watched without knowing why. I avoided remote rentals for a long time after that. I didn't stop loving the woods or the mountains, but I learned a lesson that some places, no matter how peaceful they seem, can hide very real dangers. The fear I felt wasn't imaginary, and it wasn't a story for thrill or legend. It was the simple, stark reality of being truly alone, and of someone else being there when you thought you were safe. I had been planning this solo cabin trip for months, and the day finally came when I could leave the city behind. I wanted nothing but silence and isolation, a place where I could escape the endless noise of traffic, people, and screens. The cabin I rented was deep in the woods, far off any main roads, tucked between tall pine trees and a slow, meandering creek that was visible from the back porch. The drive to the cabin had been long, twisting along narrow dirt roads that became smaller and more uneven as I went further in. The closer I got, the more the air changed. It was cooler, heavier with the smell of damp earth and pine needles, the kind of smell that felt alive and old at the same time, like the forest had been breathing for centuries before I arrived. When I finally reached the cabin, it was just as it looked online. A small wooden structure with a steep roof, a chimney that hinted at a fireplace inside, and windows that reflected the trees around it so completely it almost disappeared against the forest. There was a wooden porch with 2 old chairs, paint peeling from years of weather, and a small set of stairs leading to the front door. I parked my car on the gravel driveway and got out, letting the silence hit me all at once. There were no cars, no distant hum of electricity, no human voices, just the rustling of leaves in the wind and the occasional caw of a crow somewhere high in the trees. Inside, the cabin was rustic but well-kept. The smell of old wood mixed with a faint scent of cleaning supplies lingered in the air. There was a small kitchen with a stove and a sink, a wooden table with 2 chairs, a small living area with a couch, and the fireplace that looked like it had been used last during the winter. A narrow hallway led to a single bedroom and a bathroom. There was nothing unnecessary, no electronics, no television, just the essentials. I unpacked my backpack slowly, placing my clothes in the small closet and arranging my food and supplies on the kitchen counter. I wanted everything in its place. Being organized felt like a small piece of control in a place that was otherwise unpredictable. The first night was quiet but comforting. I built a fire in the fireplace, sitting in one of the porch chairs with a blanket around me. The light of the flames flickered against the walls, casting shadows that shifted as the fire moved. I listened to the forest around me, to the small creek in the distance, to the occasional snap of a twig that made me glance over my shoulder. My body felt tense, alert to every sound, but in a way that felt alive rather than scared. I went to bed early, feeling the weight of my exhaustion from the drive, and slept soundly under the simple blankets. The next morning, I woke to the sound of birds calling and the creek gurgling nearby. Sunlight spilled through the window, warming the wooden floor. I brewed coffee on the stove, the smell filling the cabin, and ate a simple breakfast of bread and peanut butter. I decided I would spend the day exploring the nearby woods, so I packed a small backpack with water, snacks, a flashlight, and a map I had brought just in case. I wanted to see how far I could walk without losing my bearings. The forest was dense, alive with the sounds of insects and birds. The trees towered above me, their branches interlocking to form a canopy that filtered the sunlight into dappled patches on the forest floor. The ground was soft underfoot, covered in a layer of pine needles, and I felt my steps slow as I took in the smell of damp earth, moss, and fallen leaves. I walked for hours, following the creek at first, then veering into smaller, less defined paths. The air felt heavier as I moved deeper into the woods, and I became aware of how alone I was. Not in a scary way at first, but in a way that made me notice every rustle, every distant animal call, every crack of a branch. By mid-afternoon, I realized I had wandered farther than I intended. The paths I thought I knew seemed unfamiliar, and the creek was no longer audible. I stopped to check my map, comparing it to the terrain, but the dense trees made it hard to tell exactly where I was. I marked the sun's position, trying to remember the way back, and started retracing my steps. But then I noticed something strange. Footprints in the mud. They were large, human-shaped, but the size and depth of the prints suggested someone much bigger than me had walked there recently. My heart rate increased. I looked around carefully, but the forest seemed empty, still, almost unnaturally quiet. I shook my head, telling myself it was probably someone else exploring or a local hiker. Still, I felt a prickle of unease. I continued walking, keeping my ears and eyes open. The shadows lengthened as the sun moved lower, and I realized I might be cutting it close to nightfall. I decided to head back as quickly as possible, moving at a faster pace now. That's when I heard it. The faint sound of snapping twigs behind me, irregular and soft, but unmistakably following my movements. I stopped, holding my breath, straining to hear. The sound stopped too, but then resumed a few seconds later. I quickened my pace, and the steps behind me echoed mine, keeping time with me. Panic started to creep in. I knew the forest could be dangerous, even without anyone else around. Slipping, twisting an ankle, getting lost, but now I was aware of something else. Someone or something was tracking me. I didn't dare look back fully, but the shadows between the trees seemed to shift with every glance. I focused on moving, trying to memorize landmarks. A large fallen log, a twisted pine tree, a rock shaped like a jagged triangle. I reminded myself to stay calm, to not make sudden movements, and to stick to paths I recognized. Eventually, I saw the familiar bend in the creek, and then the faint outline of the cabin through the trees. Relief washed over me, but it was tempered by the awareness that I hadn't lost whoever, or whatever, was following me. I broke into a run, lunging over roots and uneven ground, until the cabin door was in sight. I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it, pressing my back against the wood, trying to catch my breath. The forest outside was quiet again, but I could feel the tension in the air, the lingering presence that had followed me. I spent the next hours inside, checking every window, every door, making sure everything was secure. I found a long metal rod in the shed outside, something used for moving firewood, and kept it close. I prepared a fire in the fireplace, stacked enough wood to last the night, and sat near it, listening. Every sound, an animal, the wind, even the creek, made me jump. I didn't sleep that night, watching shadows dance across the walls, gripping the rod tightly, trying to calm my mind. The following morning, I decided to make a plan for leaving. I knew I couldn't stay completely isolated with the sense of being followed. It wasn't just paranoia anymore. I packed my car quickly, leaving some supplies in the cabin, and made sure the doors and windows were locked before stepping outside. The forest looked peaceful in daylight, deceptive in its tranquility. The footprints I had seen yesterday were gone, but the tracks suggested a human presence had been close, recent. I drove carefully along the dirt road, glancing at the trees along the edge of the road, still alert to movement. It took a few hours to reach the main road and civilization again, but when I did, the sense of constant observation lifted slightly. I stopped at a small store, breathing deeply, and realized how tense I had been for 2 days straight. My hands shook as I filled my water bottle, and I realized the forest had left a mark on me, not because it was inherently threatening, but because isolation and unpredictability had made me hyper-aware, made my mind fill in gaps with imagined dangers. Back in the city, I told myself the cabin trip had been worth it. I had gotten the solitude I wanted, and I had learned something about my own resilience. I also decided I would never go that far into the woods alone again. I started researching safer cabin trips, places with neighbors, cell service, and clear trails. The memory of those footsteps, the snapping twigs, the quiet tension of the forest at night, stayed with me, but it no longer held power over me. I could recall it, analyze it, understand it without panic. I had survived it, made it out safely, and learned how to trust my instincts in a real, tangible danger. Months later, I returned to a different cabin, one closer to a ranger station and with other hikers nearby. I followed marked trails, kept a phone with me, and made sure someone knew my plans. The cabin was smaller, less secluded, but I felt more at peace. I could still feel the allure of being alone in the forest, but I understood the cost of isolation, and I respected it. My first trip had been scary, yes, but it had also taught me how to navigate fear, to stay aware, and to appreciate the safety of preparation. I still sometimes dream of that first cabin, of the long shadows and the echoing footsteps, but now the memory is tempered with pride and relief. I had faced fear in a very real form, and I had come out clear-headed, unharmed, and stronger for it. I knew then that fear, in its purest form, isn't about ghosts or monsters. It's about uncertainty, about the unknown, about being aware that the world is bigger than you and not entirely under your control. And when you face that fear with preparation, patience, and awareness, you can come through it whole. That first cabin trip became a benchmark, a reference for all my later adventures, a reminder that being careful, observant, and deliberate is more important than bravado or thrill-seeking. Even now, I sometimes drive past dirt roads leading to remote cabins and glance at the forest edge, and I feel a small echo of that tension. But I also feel capable. I know how to move through the trees, how to track my steps, how to respond when something is off. That fear, once paralyzing, is now a tool, a reminder that survival is about more than courage. It's about attentiveness, strategy, and respect for the environment you enter. And in that respect, my first cabin trip, terrifying as it was, ended not with loss or panic, but with clarity, understanding, and confidence I carry with me to this day. I had been planning the trip for months, carefully picking a small, secluded cabin in the mountains. The cabin was off the grid, far from roads and neighbors, and I thought the isolation would be perfect for getting away from the stress of work and the noise of the city. I packed my car with supplies for a week: food, water, a first aid kit, a flashlight with extra batteries, a small wood stove, blankets, and extra clothing for the cold nights. I was prepared, or at least I thought I was. The drive up the mountain was longer and rougher than I expected. The narrow dirt roads twisted through dense forests, the trees pressing in on both sides, their branches brushing against the sides of the car. There were patches where the road disappeared into mud and rocks, and I had to inch forward, careful not to slip. The further I drove, the quieter it got. I realized the only sounds were the engine, the wind through the trees, and the occasional bird. No other cars passed, no houses appeared, nothing but forest. By the time I reached the final turn, I felt a creeping sense of unease, though I tried to dismiss it. The cabin appeared suddenly through the trees, simple and weathered. It looked abandoned at first, its wood darkened with age, moss creeping along the roof. A small clearing surrounded it, and a stream ran nearby, reflecting the dim light of late afternoon. I parked the car, feeling relief that I had made it. I unloaded my supplies and stepped inside. Inside, the cabin was small but functional. A single main room held a wood stove, a table, and a few chairs. A loft above had a mattress and some old blankets. The air smelled faintly of mildew, but otherwise it was clean. The walls were bare, rough wood, and the windows were dusty. I stacked my food supplies on a counter, unrolled my sleeping bag, and lit the stove. As the warmth spread, I felt my tension ease. That first night, I slept lightly. The wind outside whipped through the trees, making them groan and scrape against each other. I heard the occasional snap of a branch and the faint scurry of small animals outside. I told myself it was all normal, part of living in the wilderness. Still, when I woke in the middle of the night to a sound I couldn't immediately identify, my heart raced. Something seemed to be outside, just beyond the window. I held my breath and listened. A low, dragging noise moved through the clearing. It was slow, deliberate, and heavy. After a few minutes, it passed. I told myself it was a deer or some other large animal, but sleep did not come easily again. The next day, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. The forest was dense and uneven, with patches of brambles and steep slopes. I walked along the stream, observing the tracks in the mud. Most were small animals, but there were a few larger prints that I didn't recognize. They were not recent. The rain had washed most of them away, but I noted their size and depth. A chill ran down my spine, but I kept moving, telling myself I was imagining things. That afternoon, I tried to cut some firewood from fallen trees. The axe I brought was heavy, and I wasn't very skilled at chopping wood. Still, I managed enough to keep the stove going for the next few days. As I worked, I noticed more signs of something unusual. Some of the trees near the cabin had deep scratches in the bark, vertical and deliberate, as if made by claws or tools. My stomach tightened. I looked around but saw no one. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a bear had been here or other hikers who had passed through months ago. Still, the unease remained. The second night was worse. The wind rose stronger, rattling the windows and shaking the cabin slightly. Around midnight, I heard noises outside again. This time, it was different. The dragging sound returned, accompanied by soft thumps, like something heavy being dropped or moved. I crouched near the window, peering out into the darkness. My flashlight was inside, far from reach. I saw nothing at first. Then, just at the edge of the clearing, a shadow moved. It was too dark to make out clearly, but it was large and it didn't look like an animal. My heart raced and I felt a cold sweat. I considered leaving immediately, but the thought of walking down the steep, dark mountain road terrified me. I stayed quiet, holding my breath until the noises finally faded again. The next day, I tried to convince myself it was paranoia. I checked the perimeter of the cabin, looking for signs of anything unusual. There were more scratches on the trees, deeper this time, and the ground near the back door had impressions that looked like footprints. They were large and uneven, and they seemed to circle the cabin. I took photos with my phone, though reception was non-existent. Every instinct in me told me to leave, but I had driven hours to get here, and abandoning the trip felt impossible. I spent the next 2 days mostly inside, tending the stove, preparing food, and trying to keep busy. The forest outside felt alive in a way I hadn't noticed at first. I heard branches breaking in the distance, leaves rustling, and the occasional low growl. The sun was strong during the day, but as evening approached, shadows stretched unnaturally long, and the forest seemed to hold its breath. I tried to sleep in short bursts, the floorboards creaking under every step I took inside. By the fourth night, the tension was unbearable. I stayed awake as long as possible, keeping a hatchet nearby and listening. Around 2 a.m., the dragging noises returned, closer this time. They circled the cabin, moving slowly but deliberately. I could hear soft crunches on the gravel outside, heavy steps. The wind had died, and the only sounds were the ones I feared. I remembered the axe I had left outside. If someone had broken in, I had almost no means of defense. My mind raced with possibilities. Wild animal, intruder, someone lost in the woods, but none felt right. There was something methodical in the way the noises moved, a sense of purpose that made me freeze. I spent hours watching, listening, heart hammering. When the first light of dawn crept through the window, the noises stopped. Exhausted, I collapsed onto the mattress, but sleep did not come. I realized I had to leave. The idea of staying another night was unbearable. I packed as quickly as I could, moving silently in case whoever or whatever was outside returned. As I prepared to leave, I noticed something I had missed before. The scratches on the trees were not random. They formed a pattern, circling the cabin in a rough spiral. And the footprints, heavy and uneven, led from the back of the cabin toward the denser part of the forest, disappearing among the trees. I felt an icy realization. Something had been watching me for days, moving around the cabin, waiting. The thought of walking through the forest with that knowledge terrified me, but I had no choice. I started down the trail in daylight, moving quickly but carefully. Every sound in the forest made me flinch. The snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the sudden movement of a bird. My senses were heightened, every step deliberate. I clutched the hatchet in my hand, though it felt almost useless against whatever had been outside the cabin. Hours passed. The sun rose higher, and eventually, I reached the dirt road. I didn't slow down until I saw another car in the distance, and then I ran toward it, waving frantically. When I finally returned to civilization, I contacted the authorities. They told me the area was remote, rarely patrolled, and that other hikers had reported strange sightings and tracks over the years, though nothing confirmed. They said it could have been a poacher, someone hiding illegally in the forest, or even a large animal. I didn't know, and part of me was glad I didn't. I realized how lucky I had been to survive without confrontation. Weeks later, I went back to the cabin, this time with a team and proper support. The spiral of scratches was gone, as if erased, and the footprints had faded completely. There was no sign of recent human activity. The authorities warned me to avoid the area alone. I sold the cabin trip as a lesson learned. Sometimes, nature is dangerous not because of storms or wild animals, but because of isolation and unknown threats. I never returned alone. I never camped in that part of the forest again. Even months later, when I drove near the mountains, I felt a nervous chill and a tightening in my chest. The cabin had taught me that fear is real, and it doesn't need ghosts or fairy tales. It lives in the silence, in the shadows, in the feeling of being watched when no one is supposed to be there. And I knew, deep down, that I had narrowly escaped something I would never fully understand. I drove up the narrow, winding road in my old, rust-spotted truck, the tires crunching over the loose gravel that had been scattered unevenly over the worn asphalt. The sun was already dipping below the horizon, turning the sky into a bruised mix of dark orange and purple. I had been planning this trip for months, needing a break from the city, from the endless noise, from the constant pressure at work. I wanted a place that was quiet, far from anyone else, where I could think and maybe feel some sort of peace. I had found a small cabin online, deep in the woods of northern Maine, supposedly abandoned for years but maintained just enough that it was habitable. The pictures made it look rustic but comfortable, with a stone fireplace, wooden floors, and a few simple pieces of furniture. The owner had said that cell service was spotty at best, which was exactly what I wanted. I wanted to disappear at least for a few days. As I reached the final bend in the road, I slowed, squinting through the trees. The forest was thick here, mostly pines and oaks, their branches black against the dying light. The cabin finally came into view, partially hidden behind a line of bushes and small trees, looking smaller than the photos had made it seem. Its wooden siding was weathered gray, and a thin line of smoke was curling from the chimney, though the day was warm enough that I wondered if someone had been here recently. I pulled the truck onto the small dirt patch in front and cut the engine. The sudden silence was almost deafening. broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant caw of a crow. I grabbed my backpack and my bag of supplies and made my way up the short path to the cabin. The wooden porch creaked under my weight, and I noticed that several of the boards were warped and loose. The front door was solid wood, and the lock had been broken long ago, so it swung open with a loud groan when I pushed. Inside, the air smelled of dust, damp wood, and old smoke. The cabin was small but surprisingly intact. There was a fireplace in the center, a small kitchen to the left, and a lofted sleeping area above. Dust motes floated in the fading light from the windows, and I could see cobwebs in the corners, but overall it was clean enough to be livable. I set my bags down and lit a few candles, placing them around the main room to chase away the shadows. The first night passed quietly enough. I had brought a small pack of food, water, a few blankets, and a portable heater which I used sparingly. I slept on the old mattress in the loft, feeling the creaks of the wooden floor beneath me with every turn. It wasn't completely comfortable, but I had survived worse. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, and I could hear the distant sound of water running over rocks in a nearby stream. It was peaceful in a way that was almost unnerving, the kind of quiet that made every small sound feel amplified, like the crack of a branch or the shuffle of leaves could be a threat. The next morning, I woke to sunlight streaming through the gaps in the wooden blinds. I made coffee on the small gas stove and sat on the porch, sipping it slowly, enjoying the silence. The woods stretched in every direction, dense and unbroken, and I felt a strange mix of freedom and isolation. As the day went on, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. There was a narrow trail leading down to the stream, overgrown but passable. I walked carefully, keeping my eyes on the ground for roots and rocks, and tried to memorize the path in case I got lost. The water was clear and cold, rushing over smooth stones. I filled my bottle and splashed some on my face, feeling a little more awake and alive than I had in weeks. As the sun began to set, I returned to the cabin, my boots muddy and my legs sore. I made a simple dinner of canned beans and rice, ate slowly, and cleaned up afterward. Then I sat in the dim light, staring at the fireplace, thinking about how peaceful it was here, how removed from everything I had left behind. But as night fell, I started to notice the sounds. At first, it was the wind through the trees, which was normal. Then came something else, subtle but distinct. A series of soft thuds coming from outside, near the edge of the clearing where the cabin sat. I froze, listening. The thuds were irregular, moving closer and farther, almost like someone walking carefully on fallen branches, trying not to make noise. My heart started to race, and I grabbed the small flashlight I had brought. I went to the door slowly, peeking outside. The clearing was dark, the only light coming from the candles I had left burning inside. I couldn't see anyone, but the sound was definitely there. Something or someone was moving in the woods, circling the cabin. I kept still, trying to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a bear moving quietly over the fallen leaves. But the thuds didn't match the rhythm of a normal animal. They were deliberate, like someone was pacing or searching. I considered calling the police, but my phone barely had a signal, and I didn't want to panic myself over nothing. I stayed up most of the night, flashlight in hand, listening to every sound. Every crack of a branch made me jump. Every rustle of leaves made my heart race. I thought about leaving, but the road back to the main highway was far and treacherous in the dark. I decided I would wait until dawn, hoping daylight would make everything safer. Morning finally came, pale and gray. I stepped outside carefully, scanning the trees. There was nothing, just the wind and the occasional bird calling. But when I looked closer, I saw footprints in the soft earth around the cabin. They were large, human, and recent. They hadn't been there when I arrived. Fear settled in my stomach like a stone. Someone had been outside while I slept. Someone had walked all around the cabin, checking the doors and windows. I realized my sense of isolation had made me vulnerable. I had come here alone, and now I wasn't sure if it was safe to stay. I packed a small bag with essentials: water, food, the heater, some candles, and my knife. I didn't want to leave my truck, because it was my only way out, but I had to be careful. Over the next few days, I stayed on edge. Every sound made me jump. The wind, animals, the creaking of the cabin. It all seemed amplified. I started checking the locks on the doors and windows multiple times a day. I built a makeshift barricade on the back door with a heavy table I found in the cabin. I tried to distract myself by chopping wood, organizing supplies, and cleaning, but it was impossible to ignore the feeling that someone could be out there, watching. I found more footprints in the morning, sometimes fresh, sometimes older, circling the cabin. They were always there, but never closer than the edge of the clearing. Whoever it was, they were testing me, waiting, observing. One afternoon, I decided I needed to explore further, to understand the area and see if there was a way to signal for help. I packed lightly and followed the trail along the stream. It led deeper into the woods, where the trees grew thicker and the underbrush more tangled. After a while, I found signs of recent human activity. A discarded water bottle, a piece of torn clothing, and some footprints that didn't match mine. I realized that someone had been living in the woods nearby, maybe watching the cabin for days or weeks. Panic gripped me, but I forced myself to stay calm. I turned back, making a mental note of landmarks so I could find my way. That night, the sounds returned. Louder this time, more deliberate. Thuds, scraping noises, and faint, soft crunches of footsteps circling the cabin. I stayed in the loft, knife in hand, flashlight shining into every shadow. I tried to sleep, but it was impossible. The sense of being watched was overwhelming. I remembered the stories I had read online about people living in remote areas, about survivalists, or worse, about people who would target cabins like this for robbery or other reasons. The thought made me shiver, but it also made me more determined. I couldn't be helpless. I started making preparations. I reinforced the doors and windows, built a small alarm system using cans and string around the perimeter, and gathered heavy rocks to use as weapons if necessary. I kept the flashlight on at night, and I stayed awake for long stretches, listening, watching, waiting. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves, made me tense. I realized I couldn't just stay inside and wait. I needed a plan to leave safely. The opportunity came one morning when the forest was still quiet. I packed my truck quickly, leaving nothing behind except some old blankets. I moved quietly, checking the edges of the clearing before stepping into the open. My heart pounded as I slid into the truck and started the engine. I waited, listening. No one moved. I shifted into gear and drove slowly down the winding road, eyes scanning the trees, nerves taut. Hours passed before I saw another car or person. The isolation I had sought now felt like a trap I had narrowly escaped. I drove straight to a small town, filled the tank with gas, and called the police to report the footprints and evidence of someone lurking near the cabin. They listened, skeptical, but agreed to check it out. I gave them the directions and left, not looking back. In the days that followed, I realized how dangerous isolation could be. I had wanted peace, quiet, solitude, but I had underestimated the reality of being alone in the woods. I kept my experience to myself mostly, telling only a few close friends. I never returned to the cabin, and I never will. But I learned something important. Being alone is different from being safe. The woods are beautiful, silent, and freeing, but they can also hide danger, patience, and human threats. And sometimes, what you fear isn't some supernatural force, but a living, breathing person with unknown intentions. Now, years later, I still think about that cabin, the footprints, and the nights spent waiting in the dark. I remember every sound, every shadow, every rustle in the trees. I don't feel the same draw to the wilderness that I once did. Instead, I carry caution with me, a healthy fear of isolation, a respect for the unpredictability of people and the forest alike. I don't crave solitude anymore. I value presence, community, and the safety of knowing someone else is near. That cabin taught me more about fear than any story, any movie, any warning ever could. It taught me the value of preparedness, awareness, and instinct, and it taught me to never, ever underestimate the power of silence in the wrong hands. I had been planning this trip for months, the kind of trip where everything is stripped back to the bare essentials. No internet, no distractions, just me and the wilderness. The cabin I rented was tucked deep in the woods, far from any road I had ever heard of, reachable only by a narrow, barely marked trail that twisted and turned through the forest like a secret path no one else used. The pictures online made it look cozy. A small wooden structure with a stone chimney, a tiny porch, and a stream running just a few meters away, but pictures could never capture the isolation, and I was about to learn just how much that mattered. The first day, the drive had been long. The last hour before reaching the trailhead had been on a gravel road so uneven that I had to drive at a crawl, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. I parked my car at the edge of the forest, packed my backpack with food, water, and basic supplies and started walking. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. Leaves crunched under my boots, and every few steps I had to push aside overgrown branches that clawed at my jacket. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows that made the trees seem taller, darker, almost menacing. The cabin itself was exactly as advertised, but even at first glance, it felt more isolated than I had imagined. The surrounding forest was dense, and the stream that ran beside it was loud enough to mask most other sounds. I carried in my backpack, unpacked, and set up my sleeping area. The first night, the only sounds were the water, the wind through the trees, and the occasional snap of a branch far away. It was peaceful at first, almost soothing, but the quiet was different from the noise of city life. It had a weight to it. You could feel it pressing in on you if you weren't careful. The first real sign that something was off didn't come from the forest outside, but from inside the cabin. I woke during the night to a sound I could not place. It wasn't a footstep, not exactly, but a scraping, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. My heart leapt into my throat, but the cabin was small, and every surface was visible in the dim light from the window. Nothing seemed out of place. I chalked it up to the settling of the wood, the old cabin expanding and contracting with the night air. But sleep came reluctantly, and when I woke the next morning, my stomach was tight with unease. I spent the day trying to ignore it, keeping busy with small tasks, fetching water from the stream, chopping wood for the fireplace, exploring a little farther along the trail. The forest seemed to go on forever. Every time I thought I had reached an open area, the trees thickened again, dark and endless. I noticed broken branches in odd places, like someone had walked there recently, but no trail could be traced. Still, I pushed the thought aside, convincing myself that it was just animals, deer or perhaps a bear. By the second night, the feeling of being watched had grown. I noticed small things first. The rustle of leaves that sounded too precise, too calculated to be random. The shadows cast by the fireplace seemed to flicker even when the wind was still. I tried to focus on mundane things, keeping my fire going, arranging my supplies, but every so often I caught movement at the edges of my vision. Trees shifting, shapes that seemed to move behind them, fleeting glimpses before disappearing entirely. It was that night that I heard the knocking. Not on the cabin itself. There were no doors other than the front, which I had latched securely, but soft, deliberate, rhythmic taps coming from outside. The sound was muffled, almost as if it were coming through layers of trees, and yet it was unmistakable. I froze, every muscle in my body tensed. The knocking continued for minutes, slow, deliberate, almost testing me. I told myself it was the wind, branches tapping against the cabin, anything but what my mind feared. Eventually, it stopped, leaving a silence that was heavier, more suffocating than the noise. The next day, I ventured farther along the trail than before, trying to convince myself the isolation was harmless. I came across animal tracks, deer mostly, but something in the pattern made me pause. The prints were too large, too deep, like a human had walked there in heavy boots, but the stride was uneven, awkward. My pulse quickened, but I rationalized it. Could be a hiker, someone else renting cabins in the area. I hadn't seen a single car on the gravel road, but perhaps I wasn't the only person out here. By the third night, my nerves were raw. Every sound made me startle. The wind seemed to whisper, the stream gurgled too loudly, and every shadow seemed to stretch toward me with intent. And then the knocking came again, louder this time, sharper. Not once, but in bursts. I stayed in my bed, pressed against the wall farthest from the door, imagining every possible scenario, trying to prepare myself for what could happen. My mind kept circling back to one question. What if it wasn't the wind? What if someone had found me? Couldn't sleep. I spent hours staring at the door, fire dwindling to embers, listening. The knocks stopped abruptly at dawn. When I opened the door, I saw nothing but footprints in the dirt. Too large for deer, too erratic for any animal I knew. They circled the cabin once, then disappeared into the forest. The realization that someone had been there while I slept made me sick with fear, but also determined. I wasn't going to be caught unaware again. I spent the following day reinforcing the cabin as best I could. I moved furniture to block the door, stacked firewood against the windows, and created a makeshift alarm system using cans and string that would clang if disturbed. I stocked up on anything that could be used as a weapon, sticks, axes, even rocks, and kept them within arm's reach. My mind was a whirlpool of fear and focus, the kind of vigilance that leaves you exhausted even when you don't move. That night, the forest was alive with sounds I could no longer ignore. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, and every now and then, the sound of footsteps, sometimes slow, sometimes fast, circling the cabin. I stayed awake all night, huddled against the wall, clutching a makeshift spear I had fashioned from a broom handle and a kitchen knife. The sun finally broke through the trees, and with it, a fragile sense of relief. Whoever had been out there had retreated. I decided then that I couldn't wait any longer. The isolation, the constant fear, it was too much. I packed my essentials and began the trek back to the car. Every sound made me flinch, every shadow made me quicken my pace. The trail seemed longer, steeper, and every tree looked like it could hide someone waiting. When I finally reached the gravel road and saw my car, the relief was overwhelming. I locked the doors, started the engine, and didn't look back until I had left the forest entirely behind me. Even now, months later, I can remember the sound of those footsteps, the weight of being watched, the suffocating quiet that pressed in on me in that cabin. I know the forest is harmless to most, but for me, it will always carry that memory. A cabin meant for solitude became a cage, and the wilderness, a silent predator. I never returned, and I never will. The experience left me wary of isolation, and yet I carry a strange respect for it. I know now that the quiet is deceptive, that nature can conceal more than it reveals, and that human beings are far more vulnerable than we like to admit. The cabin itself was still there in my mind, small and unassuming, yet holding the weight of every fear I had felt. It was the most terrifying thing I had ever experienced, not because of anything supernatural, but because it made me realize how alone and exposed I really was. Even as I tell this story, I can feel the tension in my body returning, the creeping awareness that at any moment, something unseen could be just beyond my sight. That is the reality of being deep in the woods, and it is a lesson I learned the hard way. I survived because I stayed alert, because I prepared for every possibility, and because I refused to let fear paralyze me. I left the forest behind, but it left a mark on me, a memory as vivid as any sight or sound, reminding me that isolation is a force that can test the limits of human endurance. I had been driving for hours along narrow, winding forest roads that seemed to go on forever, cutting through a dense tangle of pine and fir trees. The sky was a dull gray, thick with clouds that promised rain, though nothing had fallen yet. I was alone, carrying nothing but a small backpack with food, water, and a few supplies, along with a map I had printed weeks earlier for the cabin I intended to spend the weekend in. It was an old, rustic cabin deep in the mountains, far from any town or cellular signal, the kind of place where you could really disappear from the world for a while. I had wanted peace and solitude, and I was getting it, though I had no idea just how intense that isolation could feel. The last turnoff from the main road was nothing more than a dirt path, overgrown on both sides, and it was easy to miss if you didn't know it was there. I drove slowly, letting my tires crunch over the loose gravel, the sound echoing strangely in the still air. The forest felt alive, though there was no wind, no birds, nothing to disturb it. I felt the first hint of unease just as the path narrowed to barely the width of my car. I reminded myself that this was the kind of place I had sought: seclusion, distance from everyone. But the deeper I went, the more the quiet pressed in on me. When I finally spotted the cabin, I nearly drove past it. It was small, built from rough-hewn logs that had weathered to gray with age. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the windows were grimy and clouded with dust. There was a porch, uneven and creaking with age, and a chimney that didn't look like it had been used in years. The area around it was overgrown with tall grass and weeds. I parked the car at the edge of the clearing, the engine noise abruptly stopping, leaving only the low hum of the forest. I stepped out, and my boots sank slightly into damp soil, the smell of wet earth rising around me. The first thing I noticed was how silent everything was. No birds, no wind, no rustle of animals. Just the faint hum of insects hidden somewhere in the undergrowth. I carried my backpack toward the cabin, trying to steady my nerves. The porch creaked loudly under my weight as I stepped onto it. The door was old but functional, and after a few moments of effort, I managed to push it open. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust, mold, and old wood. The air was heavy and musty, and the shadows seemed darker than they should have been. The interior was simple: a small kitchen with a wood stove that had not seen use in years, a table with 2 chairs, a small living area with a cracked leather armchair, and a tiny bedroom in the back. The windows were thick with grime, letting in very little light. I set my backpack down and walked around, checking for anything that might have been left by previous visitors. There were some old, yellowed newspapers stacked in a corner and a few rusted cans of food in the kitchen cupboard. No one else was there, and I felt both relief and a growing sense of unease at the silence. I decided to explore the surrounding area before night fell. The forest pressed close to the cabin on all sides, and the ground was uneven, covered with fallen branches and thick undergrowth. I followed a faint path that seemed to lead to a small creek a few hundred meters away. The water was shallow but clear, trickling over smooth stones, and the sound was oddly comforting. I knelt to drink, cupping my hands to bring the cold water to my lips. It was refreshing, but I noticed the way the forest seemed to close in around me, the trees bending slightly as if to block the path behind me. I shook the thought away. There was nothing here but trees and rocks, and I was perfectly safe. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sky had darkened significantly, clouds turning a deep charcoal, and a low wind had begun to stir, rustling the treetops. I decided to light a fire in the stove, wanting warmth and light. I had brought matches and some small kindling, and after several attempts, the fire caught, sputtering at first before growing into a steady blaze. The room filled with the scent of burning wood, and the shadows on the walls danced. I sat near the fire, feeling the warmth seep into my bones, and tried to relax. But as the night deepened, the silence returned, thicker this time. The wind outside picked up, moaning through the gaps in the old wooden walls. I could hear branches scraping against the roof and windows, and I realized how vulnerable I was. The cabin, which had seemed quaint and safe in daylight, now felt exposed and fragile. Every sound outside made me jump. The sudden rustle of leaves, a snapping twig, the distant cry of an animal that I couldn't identify. I tried to focus on the fire, the small circle of light it provided, but my mind kept wandering, imagining movement just beyond the reach of the firelight. Sleep was impossible. I lay on the thin mattress in the back room, listening to the storm build outside. Rain began to fall, light at first, then harder, pattering against the roof and windows, masking the other noises of the forest. But with the rain came other sounds: footsteps, faint and deliberate, crunching on the wet leaves and branches outside. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I told myself it was impossible. No one could be out here in this storm. But the sound persisted, circling the cabin, stopping at times, then moving again. It was methodical, patient, as if whoever or whatever was out there was studying the cabin, waiting. I gathered my courage and stood, grabbing a flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the wet porch, the overgrown grass, and the black forest beyond. Nothing. I stepped outside, rain soaking through my jacket, and scanned the area. No movement, no footprints other than my own leading from the car. The forest seemed to stare back at me, unbroken, unyielding. I returned to the cabin, trying to convince myself it was a deer or some other animal, but deep down I knew the sound of those steps was too deliberate, too heavy, too human. The night stretched on endlessly. Every time I thought I had dozed off, the sound of movement would wake me. I realized I had no weapon, no way to defend myself beyond the door and the thin walls. I began to make a plan, thinking ahead. If someone tried to break in, I could barricade the door with furniture. I could hide in the bedroom. I could scream if it came to that, though I doubted anyone would hear. I thought about the car, parked just beyond the clearing, and how vulnerable I would be trying to reach it in the dark, through the rain, through the forest. The sense of isolation was crushing. At dawn, the storm had passed. The forest was wet and dripping, the ground muddy. I cautiously stepped outside, flashlight still in hand, and surveyed the area. There were footprints, not animal prints, around the cabin. Heavy boots. Someone had been here during the night, circling the cabin, watching me. My stomach dropped. I felt a mix of fear and anger, but also a grim determination. I couldn't stay here another night. I had to leave. I packed quickly, grabbing my backpack and essentials, checking the cabin one last time. Everything was intact, but the sense of intrusion was palpable. The forest seemed normal in the daylight, the sunlight filtering through the trees, birds beginning to call again. But the tracks told a different story. I followed the dirt path back to the main road, moving as quickly as I could while keeping alert. Every snapping branch, every rustle in the undergrowth made me flinch, but I pressed on, fueled by adrenaline and the need to reach safety. It took hours, longer than I expected, and I was soaked from the earlier rain. Eventually, the trees thinned, and I spotted the familiar pavement of the main road. Relief washed over me. I walked until I reached a small gas station at the edge of a town, muddy and exhausted. I bought a bottle of water and sat in the car, taking deep breaths. I called the local authorities, explaining the cabin, the tracks, everything I had seen and heard. They took notes and promised to send someone, but I knew it would be too late to catch anyone. I was just grateful to be out of that forest, to feel human civilization around me again. In the weeks that followed, I learned from the local sheriff that the area had a history of break-ins, hikers disappearing, and isolated cabins being used by squatters or criminals hiding from the law. The cabin I had stayed in was apparently known among them as a place that attracted people seeking solitude, and it had been visited before by strangers, some with violent intentions. I realized how lucky I had been to leave when I did, how easy it could have been for the situation to turn deadly. I never returned to that cabin. I kept the memory of it clear in my mind. The oppressive silence, the sound of those heavy footsteps, the feeling of being watched in the dark, the fragile safety of the walls around me. But I also remembered the relief of the main road, the warmth of light in the gas station, the knowledge that I had survived. That experience changed the way I approached the wilderness, the way I planned trips, the way I respected the isolation. I learned that solitude could be beautiful, but it could also be dangerous, and that sometimes the most terrifying things in the forest are not animals or storms, but people with intentions unknown. I started carrying more supplies, learning survival skills, and always letting someone know my exact location. I never underestimated the importance of safety and preparation again. And though I still loved the mountains, I knew I would never feel the same naive trust in a remote cabin, alone with no one else around. I had survived, and that survival had come with lessons burned into my memory, lessons about caution, awareness, and the fragility of human life when isolated in the wilderness. I had always thought that escaping to a remote cabin in the woods would be the perfect way to clear my head. The city had become unbearable, with constant noise, crowded streets, and the never-ending rhythm of work that left me exhausted and empty. I found a cabin for rent through a small listing online. It was deep in a national forest, far from any main roads, and the photos showed a rustic wooden structure surrounded by dense trees. No neighbors for miles, just me, the forest, and the quiet I craved. I convinced myself that it would be good for me, that a few days alone would help me feel alive again. I packed my car with everything I thought I would need: food, water, blankets, batteries, a first aid kit, and a small camping stove. I also took my laptop and a few books, but I promised myself I wouldn't spend too much time inside. I wanted to feel the forest. The drive itself was long, winding through narrow roads that cut through endless woods. I passed signs warning about wildlife, but I wasn't concerned. I was careful by nature and had grown up around animals. I even joked to myself that the worst thing I might see would be a deer or maybe a raccoon. By the time I reached the last dirt road leading to the cabin, the sun was beginning to lower in the sky. Shadows stretched across the road, the light turning the trees into dark, leaning shapes. I slowed down, gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual, even though nothing felt immediately threatening. The cabin came into view, a small, wooden structure with a steep roof, smoke curling from the chimney in the picture, though in reality, the chimney was empty. There was a fire pit outside and a stack of wood, and the forest surrounded it on all sides. It was exactly as advertised, quiet and isolated. I parked my car and stepped out. The air was cooler than I expected. A faint wind whispered through the trees, rustling leaves. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the city lift from my shoulders. The cabin smelled faintly of dust and wood, the kind of smell that made me feel like I had stepped back in time. I set down my bags and explored the small cabin. It had a main room with a table, 2 chairs, a small stove, and a tiny kitchen counter. There was a single bedroom with a bed and a dresser. The bathroom was functional but bare, with only a small mirror and a sink. Nothing luxurious, nothing unnecessary, but everything I needed. I felt a strange calm settle over me as I walked through the space, the silence pressing gently on my ears. The first night was quiet. I made a small fire in the wood stove, ate a simple dinner of canned beans, and poured myself some water. I sat near the window, watching the dark forest. The wind had picked up slightly, making branches scrape against the cabin's walls. It sounded louder than it should have, almost as if the trees themselves were moving in slow, deliberate ways. I felt a small shiver, not from fear but from the oddness of how alive the forest seemed in the dark. I went to bed early, thinking about the long hike I planned for the next day. The second day started gray, with low clouds pressing down through the treetops. I decided to explore a trail I had read about online. It was supposed to lead to a small river, a place where people occasionally camped or fished. I took my backpack, filled with water, snacks, a map, and a flashlight, and set out. The trail was overgrown in parts, the forest thick with trees that bent over the path. There was a smell of wet earth and moss, and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot reminded me that I was not alone. Birds called faintly in the distance, but the deeper I went, the quieter everything became. It was peaceful, yet tense, the kind of quiet that made me hyper-aware of every sound, every movement. Hours passed, and I found the river. It was small but fast-moving, cutting through rocks and fallen branches. I sat for a while, resting my legs and watching the water. It made a soothing noise, rushing and bubbling, a sharp contrast to the stillness of the forest. I hiked back slowly, knowing the cabin would be waiting, a safe place to return to. That night, the wind was stronger. I could hear it pressing against the walls, rattling the windows. I double-checked the doors and locks before going to bed, telling myself that I was simply being cautious. The forest was vast, and I was alone, but there was nothing threatening here, nothing beyond the normal wild. On the third day, things began to feel different. I noticed that my food supply seemed smaller than I remembered, even though I had only eaten a few meals. I chalked it up to my own miscalculation, thinking perhaps I had underestimated my appetite. But then, I started noticing small things out of place. The firewood stacked neatly outside had a few logs shifted. The kitchen counter had a small smudge that wasn't there before, and my backpack, which I always left on the chair, had moved slightly. I convinced myself that the wind or my own clumsiness could explain it. After all, I had no reason to suspect anyone else. The cabin was isolated. No one could reach it without a long drive through rough forest paths. The fourth day brought rain. I stayed inside, watching the water stream down the windows, counting the trees swaying in the storm. That night, I heard it for the first time. Footsteps outside. At first, I thought it was the wind, or perhaps an animal, but the sound was deliberate, slow, and uneven. Not the quiet, light steps of a deer or a raccoon, but heavier, closer to the sound of boots on wood. I froze, listening, every nerve taut. The footsteps circled the cabin, slow, deliberate, and then stopped. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a lost hiker, maybe a ranger checking the area, but the thought of someone walking in the woods in a storm all this distance from any road seemed improbable. I stayed in bed, clutching a kitchen knife I had brought for protection, waiting until the sound finally faded into the wind. The next morning, I went outside. There were footprints in the mud around the cabin. Human footprints, not animal. They were heavy, size 8 or 9, and they circled the cabin several times before disappearing into the forest. Panic rose in me, a raw, physical sensation that made my hands shake. I thought about leaving immediately, driving back to the main road and calling the police, but the storm had turned the dirt road to mud. My car would likely get stuck if I tried to leave. I had no choice but to stay, at least for the moment. I packed my essential items, just in case, and kept the knife with me at all times. Every sound outside now made me flinch. The forest no longer a peaceful refuge, but a place of uncertainty. Over the next 2 days, the intruder or intruders made their presence known in subtle ways. Food packages were moved, small items on the counter shifted, and I found more footprints around the cabin. I even heard faint scraping on the roof one night, slow and methodical, as if someone was testing the structure or simply walking around. I stopped going near the windows, focusing instead on the interior, barricading the doors as best as I could. Sleep became impossible. I stayed awake for long stretches, listening to the wind and the sound of branches tapping against the cabin, imagining the shadowy figure moving just outside, watching me. The isolation that once felt peaceful had transformed into a trap. By the 6th day, I realized I needed a plan. I couldn't stay in the cabin indefinitely. I had to escape. I mapped out the route in my head, noting the positions of trees, rocks, and the nearest main road. I also prepared a backpack with essentials, water, snacks, the knife, and a flashlight. I moved quietly through the cabin, checking that the doors and windows were as secure as possible to delay any potential intruder while I made my move. I told myself I would leave at first light, moving quickly through the forest until I reached a road where I could signal for help or flag down a passing car. The next morning, I waited until the sky lightened, clouds breaking to reveal faint sun. I left the cabin slowly, making as little noise as possible. My heart pounded with every step, my senses screaming with every crack of a branch beneath my boots. I moved steadily through the forest, careful not to make wide arcs or noises that could reveal my path. Hours passed, but eventually, I saw the edge of the main road. Relief flooded me, almost paralyzing. I ran the last few meters and stood on the asphalt, breathing heavily, watching the forest behind me. There was no one there. The prints, the footsteps, the nighttime scraping, all gone. Just the empty, silent forest. I reached the nearest town later that morning, exhausted, muddy, and emotionally drained. I reported the situation to the authorities, who listened and took notes. They told me that there had been occasional reports of trespassers in the forest, usually hikers or campers who pushed boundaries, but nothing dangerous had been documented in years. Still, I gave them the footprints, the descriptions, and the timeline. They promised to patrol the area, but I knew that part of me would never return to that cabin or that forest. The sense of vulnerability, of being watched in a place that should have been safe, had left a permanent mark. Weeks later, I visited the cabin with a friend, just to see it in daylight with someone else. It looked normal, peaceful even, nothing to suggest the terror I had experienced. But I stayed near the road, unable to approach as closely as before. The forest was quiet, ordinary, but I knew better now. Solitude and isolation could be dangerous, not because of ghosts or fairy tales, but because humans can be threats, lurking quietly, observing, and waiting for the right moment. The cabin remained beautiful, but I understood that beauty could mask danger. That understanding, that awareness, was the only thing I brought back from the forest, and it changed the way I viewed every quiet, isolated place from then on. I had planned the trip for months. It was supposed to be a quiet retreat, a break from the city, from people, from constant noise and pressure. I found a cabin online tucked deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town, with no electricity, no running water, just a fireplace and a small gas stove. The pictures online made it look perfect. A rustic wooden structure surrounded by thick pine forests, a small creek running a few hundred feet away, and trails that led deeper into untouched wilderness. I imagined myself sitting on the porch in the morning, coffee in hand, watching sunlight filter through the fog between the trees. The kind of peaceful solitude that makes your chest feel lighter, like you are breathing properly for the first time in years. The drive there had taken longer than I anticipated. The directions were old, the GPS signal patchy, and the last 20 miles were on a narrow dirt road that wound through thick woods and over small hills. The car rattled and bounced with every pothole, and I had to slow to a crawl in several stretches just to avoid scraping the undercarriage. I remember the smell of wet leaves and dirt through the open window, the cold air carrying hints of smoke from distant, unseen fires. The sky had turned from bright morning to heavy gray clouds by the time I reached the cabin. It was smaller than I expected when I finally arrived, but solid, sturdy, and smelled of wood and damp earth. Moss and small plants had taken root along the roof edges, and the porch sagged slightly in the middle. The door creaked when I opened it, revealing a single room with a stone fireplace, a few wooden chairs, a table, and a small loft accessible by a ladder. A stack of firewood was neatly piled against one wall, and an old oil lamp sat on the table. It smelled faintly of old pine and smoke, like the cabin had been used occasionally but not lived in regularly. I set down my bag and immediately felt the change. The silence was so heavy it pressed against my ears. No traffic, no birds, nothing but the wind brushing through the trees and the occasional drip of water from the roof. The first night passed quietly, though it wasn't entirely comfortable. The wind howled outside, and at some point I thought I heard a branch scrape against the window, but I didn't investigate. The cabin was small enough that every sound echoed inside, and every shadow seemed to linger just a little longer than it should. I lit the fireplace, stacked more wood, and tried to relax by reading the small, dog-eared book I had brought. Sleep eventually came, though it was fitful. I woke several times to the sound of wood creaking and the wind slamming branches against the cabin. The next morning, I decided to explore the area. I had brought proper boots, a backpack, and enough food and water for a week. The trail behind the cabin led into thick forest, the kind where sunlight barely reaches the ground. Moss grew in thick carpets over rocks and tree roots, and fallen branches created a soft, muffled floor. I walked for hours, taking in the scenery, the distant creek, the way mist curled around the trees, the small sounds of wildlife, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Not by a person, at least I didn't see anyone, but the stillness of the forest made every movement of the trees feel deliberate, every rustle of leaves a sign that something was out there, just beyond my sight. I returned to the cabin in the late afternoon, sweating and tired, my legs aching from the uneven ground. The cabin felt smaller now, more confining, the silence oppressive. I built another fire, cooked a simple meal of canned beans and rice, and tried to focus on routine tasks: chopping wood, cleaning up, organizing my supplies. But even in the mundane, I felt tension building, a sense of being on edge that wouldn't go away. That night, the wind picked up. It wasn't just normal wind, but a kind of persistent, gnawing force that rattled the windows and doors. I double-checked the locks and pushed heavy furniture against the door. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside, deliberate and heavy, crunching in the thin layer of leaves and dirt near the porch. I froze. The cabin had no electricity, so I couldn't see beyond the dim glow of the fireplace, but I could hear it clearly. Someone or something was moving around the cabin, circling it, testing it. My first instinct was to call out, but I remembered the distance to any neighbor, the lack of cell signal, and the weight of the knife I kept in my bag. I stayed quiet, barely breathing, waiting. The steps moved away after what felt like an eternity, fading into the wind and the darkness. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I found evidence of someone having been near the cabin. Small footprints in the soft dirt outside, too small to belong to me, leading around the cabin and back into the woods. The thought of someone watching, someone potentially dangerous, made my stomach turn. I considered leaving immediately but felt a strange, stubborn need to stay. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was pride, but I packed my day bag and set out again, this time with extra caution. I carried a small hatchet, checked the path behind me constantly, and kept my senses alert to every sound. By the second day, the cabin felt hostile. The forest itself seemed to close in, and the wind carried strange, indistinct sounds. Twigs snapping, low grunts, the scrape of claws. I discovered signs of recent human presence along the trails. Broken branches, scraps of paper, faint markings on trees. Whoever or whatever was out there, they were tracking the area, maybe even the cabin itself. I tried to maintain rational thought, reminding myself that hunters or hikers could be passing by, but the details didn't match. No camping gear, no backpacks, nothing like that. Just traces that seemed deliberate, calculated, meant to signal that someone had been watching. That night, I barricaded the cabin as best as I could. I piled furniture against the door, lined up chairs to block the windows, and kept the fireplace going to provide light and warmth. I moved my sleeping bag near the ladder to the loft, thinking that might give me a slight advantage if someone entered. The wind roared, but I also heard it. Soft, careful steps circling the cabin. Closer this time, deliberate pauses near the windows. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might echo outside. I gripped the hatchet and waited. Hours passed. I couldn't sleep, and exhaustion settled in like a weight pressing my chest. The following day, I decided I had to leave, but the forest seemed to have changed overnight. Trails that had been clear were now overgrown. Signs of wildlife were more frequent, and the underbrush had grown thick and tangled. I realized I could be walking in circles without knowing it. I packed essentials in a backpack and started walking cautiously, marking my path with small scratches on tree bark and rocks. After hours of slow movement, the sun dipping low in the sky, I realized I had no idea where I was. Panic started to rise, but I forced myself to focus on breathing, listening, and observing. Every step could be crucial. By late afternoon, I stumbled upon a creek I didn't remember seeing. I followed it downstream, hoping it would lead me to a road or some sign of civilization. The water was cold and murky, and the banks were slippery. At one point, I almost fell, catching myself on a tree root. My hands were scratched and bleeding, but I kept moving. The forest felt endless, suffocating, and the sense of being watched never left me. Around dusk, I finally saw something that gave me hope. A faint trail of tire tracks in the dirt, almost overgrown but unmistakable. I followed it, heart racing, adrenaline pushing me forward despite exhaustion. As night fell completely, I came to a small dirt road. It wasn't paved, but it led out of the woods. I ran along it, not looking back, until I finally saw the lights of a small town in the distance. My legs burned, my lungs ached, but the sight of houses and cars, signs of normal life, made me almost collapse with relief. I reported the situation to the local authorities the next morning. They told me that people occasionally used the area illegally, campers, hunters, sometimes even squatters, but they would check the cabin and surrounding forest. A few days later, I received confirmation. The cabin had been visited by unknown individuals who left behind evidence of recent human activity. No one was harmed, but the reports confirmed what I had feared. I was being watched, my isolation exploited by someone familiar with the area, someone who knew how to use the forest as cover. I never returned to that cabin. The experience left me with a constant awareness whenever I go into the woods, a lingering sense of vulnerability. I think about that trip often, the oppressive silence, the feeling of being observed, the struggle to navigate an environment that had been peaceful in my imagination but had become threatening in reality. It was a harsh reminder that isolation can be dangerous, that the world beyond the city isn't always quiet and safe, and that survival sometimes depends on awareness, caution, and respect for the unknown paths people, or others, might take. The first thing I noticed when I arrived at the cabin was how quiet it was. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but a heavy, almost pressing silence that seemed to wrap around the trees and the thin dirt road that led here. The forest felt dense, the air thick with damp earth and the smell of pine. I had driven nearly 2 hours from the nearest town, the route winding and narrow, the asphalt fading into gravel and then into bare soil. My plan had been simple. A few days alone in the cabin, a break from the city, away from the constant noise, the people, the responsibilities. I had imagined sitting by the small fireplace, reading books I hadn't touched in months, cooking simple meals, and sleeping with nothing but the sound of wind and occasional birds. I hadn't imagined anything frightening. Not once. The cabin itself was older than I expected. From the outside, it looked sturdy, built with thick logs darkened by decades of weather. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, the shingles mottled and cracked, and the windows were small, dusty, and covered in faded curtains. Still, it had a strange charm. It was isolated in the most absolute sense. The nearest other building was probably a mile away, if not more. That had been part of the appeal. Inside, the air smelled of wood and dust, with a faint, sour hint that I couldn't immediately place. The cabin had a single main room, a small kitchen in one corner, and a narrow hallway that led to 2 bedrooms and a tiny bathroom. The furniture was old but functional. A worn couch, a rickety dining table, and a bed that looked like it had seen decades of use. There was a wood stove that seemed functional, though the chimney would probably need cleaning, and a pile of firewood stacked awkwardly in a corner. I spent the first afternoon unpacking, sweeping, and opening the windows to let the air circulate. It was hot from the sun, and the cabin trapped the heat, making it feel stuffy inside. Outside, the forest was alive with sound. Birds calling, insects buzzing, the occasional rustle of leaves that could have been an animal moving through the undergrowth. I told myself it was just the normal activity of wildlife. I was careful to secure the windows and doors, though, and I made a mental note to check the locks every night. That evening, I made a fire in the stove and cooked a simple meal. As the flames crackled and the cabin darkened, shadows stretched across the walls, but I tried to ignore the uneasy feeling that crept up my spine. It was easy to tell myself it was just being alone in a new place. The first night was quiet, the kind of quiet that made every sound outside exaggerated. The snap of a twig, the wind through the trees, distant animal calls. I slept fitfully, waking at intervals, convinced I had heard someone walking around outside, though the moonlight showed nothing. The second day, I decided to explore the immediate area. There was a small clearing behind the cabin, overgrown with weeds and brambles, and a narrow trail leading further into the forest. I followed it as far as I dared, taking note of the dense undergrowth, the fallen trees, and the occasional deer tracks in the mud. The trail seemed to twist and turn, ending abruptly at a small creek with water so clear I could see the stones at the bottom. I walked back carefully, keeping track of the path, feeling a mixture of awe and unease at how deep the forest went, how alone I truly was. By the third day, the cabin felt less like a retreat and more like a trap. Small things began to unsettle me. Doors I was sure I had locked were slightly ajar. Items I had placed carefully were moved. I told myself it was careless unpacking, perhaps the wind, perhaps animals getting in, but a part of my mind refused to be fully convinced. At night, the sounds outside were sharper, closer, as if something or someone was moving deliberately near the cabin. My first instinct was to rationalize. Deer, raccoons, maybe a fox. But the sound of heavy footsteps crunching leaves, slow and deliberate, did not match anything I knew. On the fourth night, it happened. I woke suddenly to the sound of the front door creaking. My heart raced. I froze, listening. The sound stopped. I told myself it must have been the wind, though the air was still, and I had checked the door before sleeping. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, counting every small noise, every shift of wood in the house. Then I heard it again. Faint, but distinct. A scrape against the wooden frame, as if someone was trying to test it, feel it, prod it. I got up slowly, trying not to make any sound. I grabbed the small flashlight I kept in the kitchen drawer and crept to the front door. Outside, nothing. The gravel driveway was empty, smooth, and undisturbed. No footprints. Nothing. I stood there for several minutes, ears straining, but the forest remained silent. Shaking, I went back to bed, bolting the door, placing a chair under the handle for extra measure. Sleep didn't come. The next day, I decided I had to leave. The unease had turned into something more than fear. It was a primal awareness that something wasn't right. I packed my essentials and loaded the car. Before leaving, I checked all the locks again. That's when I noticed it. Deep scratches along the outside of the door frame, almost hidden by shadow, fresh enough that the splinters were still raw. My stomach dropped. I felt watched, hunted, and suddenly the idea of the long drive back seemed a relief, a chance to leave this place and never return. As I drove down the dirt road, I tried to convince myself it was some local animal, perhaps a bear or a large dog. But the marks were too precise, too deliberate, the pacing too human. The memory of the sounds at night, the creaks, the testing of the door, gnawed at me. I looked in the rearview mirror at the dark forest shrinking behind me, imagining the way the shadows would stretch across the cabin, the way any movement inside could hide a person crouched in wait. I reported the cabin to the local authorities the next day. They came out, inspected the building, and found more evidence. Footprints around the perimeter that led into the woods, impressions in the soft soil where someone had crouched, even small items that had been moved, likely from inside. They took the scratches on the door frame as evidence of attempted entry. According to them, it seemed like someone had been using the cabin as a hideout or a staging area, and I had been lucky to arrive before the intruder returned. They assured me that patrols would increase in the area, but my sense of security had been shattered. In the following weeks, I replayed the experience constantly, examining every detail. The sound of the first creak, the feeling of being watched in the clearing, the way the forest seemed to close in at night. I realized how fragile the illusion of safety can be. Even a place meant for peace, meant for solitude, can become terrifying when the unknown lurks close. I learned to check locks meticulously, to trust my instincts, and to respect isolation. The cabin itself eventually changed hands, but I never went back. The experience left a permanent mark on me, a reminder that danger can hide in the most mundane places, and that the smallest details, the sound of a door, the scratch on wood, the faint movement in shadows, can signal something far more serious than one ever expects. Months later, when I finally let myself think about it without panic, I understood that the ordeal had taught me vigilance. I began preparing more carefully for trips, never assuming solitude meant safety. I learned to read the land, to notice footprints and marks that seemed insignificant at first, and to always consider that even remote places can be dangerous when other humans are involved. The cabin, abandoned and silent now, remained a symbol in my mind, a stark lesson that safety is never guaranteed, even in places meant for retreat and peace. The forest held its secrets, some harmless, some not, and I had glimpsed the side that was not. I still think about the marks on the door, the impressions in the dirt, the night when I could almost feel someone's eyes on me through the walls. I understand now that the terror wasn't supernatural, it was human, and that realization makes it more real, more chilling. But the ending of the story is that I survived, learned, and returned to the world with a new respect for caution. I never looked at isolation the same way again, and I never underestimated how much a person or a cabin can conceal until you are already inside. I had been planning the cabin trip for months. It was supposed to be a short getaway from the noise and obligations of city life, a chance to be alone with nothing but nature and the silence I could never seem to find in my daily life. I found a small, secluded cabin listed online, deep in a forest in northern Pennsylvania. The photos were simple but inviting. A wooden structure, weathered but solid, surrounded by trees so dense that it felt like the world ended at the edge of the clearing. There was no cell service and no nearby neighbors for miles, which was exactly what I wanted. I packed my car carefully, making sure I had extra food, water, a first aid kit, lanterns, and a heavy-duty flashlight. I wanted to be prepared, even though I told myself I was just going for a quiet weekend. The drive was long and slow. As I left the main roads behind, the asphalt turned into gravel, then dirt, then a narrow path lined by trees so tall and thick that sunlight barely touched the ground. The forest felt endless, and the air was heavy with the smell of damp soil, pine, and decay. There were no sounds except for the occasional bird call and the distant rustle of leaves. I could feel the tension in my chest loosening a little. This was what I had come for. The cabin appeared suddenly as I rounded a bend, its wooden walls blending with the surrounding trees, as if it had always been part of the forest. The small clearing around it was overgrown with grass and weeds, and there was a thin layer of pine needles covering the wooden deck in front of the cabin. It looked abandoned, but in a way that was comforting rather than alarming. I unloaded my car, carrying the bags inside one at a time. The cabin smelled faintly of damp wood and old smoke, like someone had lived there decades ago and left in a hurry. There was no electricity, and the windows were dark, allowing only the faintest light to filter in. I lit a few candles and set up the lanterns. The interior was simple: a small kitchen, a living area with a rickety couch, a table, and a wood-burning stove. A narrow hallway led to a single bedroom and a bathroom that looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. I checked the fireplace, stacking some dry logs I found in the corner, and felt a small sense of satisfaction. I was prepared for the night. The first evening passed uneventfully. I cooked a simple meal on the stove and ate slowly, savoring the quiet. Outside, the forest darkened, and the only sound was the wind moving through the trees. I thought about how alone I was, and the thought was strangely soothing. After washing up, I lay in the bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to the distant creaks and groans of the cabin. It was normal for an old wooden building to settle, but there was a faint unease gnawing at the edges of my mind. I shook it off and eventually fell asleep. When I woke, the sky was gray, and a thin drizzle was falling. I spent the morning exploring the clearing and the edge of the forest. The air was damp and smelled of wet leaves, and every step I took squelched in the mud. There were animal tracks everywhere: deer, rabbits, and smaller rodents, but I didn't see anything. It felt alive, almost too alive, like the forest was watching. I tried not to think about it and went back to the cabin to dry off. Later that day, I noticed that one of the windows in the living area didn't close properly. The latch was rusted, and the frame had warped. I pushed it shut as best I could, but it still rattled with the wind. It wasn't a big deal, but it left me with a lingering sense of vulnerability. In the evening, I built a fire in the stove and sat close, feeling the heat against my face. The wind had picked up, and it was hitting the cabin with a low, constant roar. Every now and then, a branch would scrape against the walls. The sound was sharp and unnatural in the quiet, and I realized how easy it would be for someone or something to approach unnoticed. I told myself it was nothing and tried to focus on the warmth of the fire. The next morning, the rain had stopped, but the forest was soaked, heavy with mist. I decided to go for a short hike along a trail I had noticed the day before. I brought the flashlight, even though it was broad daylight, and my backpack contained water, snacks, and a small hatchet. The trail was narrow and overgrown, and after about 30 minutes, I realized I had wandered farther than I intended. The forest was denser here, the trees twisted and old, with thick undergrowth that made progress slow. Every step was careful, mindful of roots, rocks, and hidden holes. It was exhausting, but the isolation was what I craved. I stopped to rest near a small stream. The water was cold and clear, and I bent down to drink a little. I heard a snapping sound nearby, like a branch breaking under weight. I froze and scanned the trees. There was nothing visible, but the sound had been too deliberate to be random. My heart picked up slightly, but I told myself it was probably a deer or another animal. I stayed there for a few more minutes, listening, until the sound of water and wind drowned out any other noise. Eventually, I stood and continued on the trail. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sky was overcast and the light was dim. I noticed that one of the boards near the cabin's back entrance was loose. It wasn't something I remembered seeing before. I pulled it gently. It rattled but didn't come off. A thought struck me. Had someone been here recently? I tried to dismiss it. I was alone. No one else was supposed to be in these woods, but the uncertainty settled in my stomach like a stone. I checked all the doors and windows again, making sure they were secure, and decided to stay inside for the evening. That night, the wind was relentless. It shook the cabin violently, rattling the windows and making the old wooden walls creak and groan. I lit all the candles and stayed close to the fire. I tried to read, but every little noise drew my attention. The scrape of a branch, the distant thud of something falling, the whisper of movement outside. I started pacing, trying to calm myself. Around midnight, I noticed a faint smell. Smoke, but not from the fire. It was acrid, sharp, and it made my throat burn. I grabbed the flashlight and went outside, sweeping it over the clearing. There was nothing visible, no fire, no smoke rising from anywhere nearby. The air was damp, carrying scents strangely far. I felt uneasy and went back inside, double-checking the doors. I could almost feel a presence outside, something watching, but it was invisible, silent. The next day, I resolved to stay close to the cabin. I cleaned, organized supplies, and kept the fire burning constantly. The quiet forest that had been comforting before now felt suffocating. Shadows moved strangely, and every sound was amplified. I began noticing small things. Footprints in the mud near the cabin that weren't mine, a broken twig by the window, slight disturbances in the leaves around the cabin. I told myself it was probably animals, but the patterns seemed too deliberate. That evening, as darkness fell, I saw a figure through the mist outside, a human shape moving between the trees. My first reaction was disbelief, but it was unmistakable. Someone was there, watching. Panic surged through me. I retreated inside, locked the doors, and sat close to the stove with the hatchet I had brought for firewood. I listened, straining to catch any sound, but the figure didn't move closer. The night was long, each minute stretching into an eternity. The wind, the trees, and my own heartbeat became a single relentless sound. By morning, the figure had gone. The footprints remained, fresh in the mud, leading away from the cabin. I realized that the person had been there overnight, hiding, waiting. I packed quickly, leaving most of my belongings behind. I took only what I could carry and started down the trail, moving as quickly and silently as possible. The forest seemed endless, and every sound made me jump. I clutched the hatchet and flashlight, ready for anything. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but the adrenaline kept me going. After hours of walking, I finally reached the dirt road I had driven in on. Relief washed over me. I didn't look back. I drove as fast as the rough road allowed, my eyes constantly scanning the trees on either side. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, a small cluster of buildings with people moving about in the morning. I felt a kind of shock settling over me, my body shaking from exhaustion and fear. I reported the cabin and the trespassing to the local authorities. They took my statement seriously, noting that the area had a history of break-ins and vagrants hiding in the woods, but they couldn't guarantee the person had been caught. In the following weeks, I learned that the cabin had been broken into by squatters several times in the past. The dense forest provided perfect cover, and people would live there for days or weeks without being noticed. I realized how naive I had been, assuming that the isolation of the forest meant safety. I had expected silence and solitude, but instead, I had found that the woods could conceal not only beauty and peace, but danger as well. The experience stayed with me. The fear, the sense of being watched, the realization that safety could never be guaranteed. It changed the way I approached solitude, making me more cautious, more aware, and more respectful of the wilderness. I never returned to that cabin. I learned that nature could be peaceful and serene, but it could also hide threats, both animal and human. Being alone in the forest meant confronting not just the isolation but the reality that someone else could be there without your knowledge. I chose safer cabins after that, ones within reach of roads and other people, with locks that worked and neighbors within shouting distance. The fear I felt in that forest stayed with me, but it was also a lesson. Preparation and vigilance were not paranoia, but necessity. The isolation I once craved had shown me its other face, the face of vulnerability, and I would never forget it. I understood now that peace was not just the absence of sound, but the presence of safety, and the forest could not always guarantee either. I had been planning the trip for weeks. After months of working long hours at a job that left me drained and hollow, I needed a break, a place where I could be alone with my thoughts. The internet had offered up countless options, but I settled on a cabin deep in the forest of northern Idaho. From the pictures, it looked perfect. Isolated, surrounded by dense pines, with a small creek running nearby. The kind of place where the noise of the world felt like a distant memory and every day could stretch into hours of quiet and peace. I arrived in the late afternoon. The drive itself had been long, the asphalt winding through hills and forests that grew thicker with each mile. By the time I reached the dirt road leading to the cabin, the sun was already dipping behind the horizon, painting the sky in a streak of dull oranges and purples. The road was narrow and uneven, littered with rocks and fallen branches. My car bounced along the path, and I kept one hand on the steering wheel and the other gripping the seat. Somewhere between the last bend and a small clearing, I realized that I hadn't seen a single house or car for nearly 30 minutes. Not one sign of civilization. The silence was thick, almost tangible, pressing against the car. I kept my eyes on the road and my mind on the thought that soon I would be inside the cabin, safe. The cabin looked smaller than the pictures suggested, but sturdier. Its wooden walls were dark and weathered, and the roof was low, with patches where the shingles had curled or fallen away. There was a small porch with a rickety railing, and a woodpile stacked neatly beside the side wall. I parked and stepped out, stretching my legs. The air smelled of wet earth and pine needles. Everything was silent except for the distant murmur of the creek and the occasional rustle of leaves. Inside, the cabin was cramped but cozy. There was a small kitchen area, a wood-burning stove, a single bed pushed against the far wall, and a wooden table with 2 chairs. The floor creaked underfoot, and the walls had small gaps that let the wind whisper through. There was no electricity, which I had expected, and the cabin relied on candles, the fireplace, and a small battery-powered lantern I had brought along. I set my backpack down, unpacked a few essentials, and lit a fire in the stove. The smell of burning wood filled the space, warming the room and pushing back the damp chill that clung to the walls. The first night passed uneventfully. I stayed awake longer than usual, staring into the flames, thinking about how isolated I was. There were sounds outside, the soft brush of wind against trees, the creek flowing, distant thumps that could have been deer or some other animal, but nothing alarming. I went to bed, feeling tired but content, and slept heavily. The next morning, I woke to the sound of the creek and birds. The forest was bright and alive, sunlight breaking through the canopy in golden beams. I decided to explore the area around the cabin. There was a small trail that ran parallel to the creek, and I followed it for a few hours, watching squirrels dart through the underbrush and birds flit from branch to branch. It was peaceful, almost therapeutic. I returned to the cabin in the late afternoon, my legs sore but my mind lighter than it had been in months. But that evening, the first sense of unease arrived. I was chopping wood for the stove when I noticed that something had moved across the edge of the clearing. A figure, maybe, or an animal. It disappeared quickly behind the trees, but it was close enough that I froze, gripping the axe tightly. I called out, though I knew no one would hear me, and the forest returned only silence. Shaking, I went back inside and bolted the door. I tried to convince myself it was just a deer or maybe a stray dog, but the feeling lingered. Over the next day, the sense of being watched grew. I started noticing things out of place. A rock moved from where I had left it on the porch. footprints in the mud that weren't mine. The creek sounded different somehow, quieter, as though the air around it had thickened. I tried to tell myself it was my imagination, but I couldn't shake the prickling feeling along my spine whenever I stepped outside. I began keeping the axe close, leaning it against the wall when I wasn't holding it. On the third day, I decided to go farther along the trail. The forest opened up into a small clearing, overgrown with tall grass. I saw animal tracks in the soft mud, but there was something odd about them. They weren't deer or dog prints, they were too large, too heavy, like someone had walked through with boots. I froze, scanning the edges of the clearing. The trees seemed to shift, shadows lengthening unnaturally as the sun dropped. I turned and ran back to the cabin, my heart hammering, my breath shallow. By the time I reached the cabin, I was shaking. The door was exactly where I had left it, but the lock felt different, harder to turn, as if someone had tested it. That night, I hardly slept. Every sound outside, the creak of a branch, the rustle of leaves, set me on edge. I kept the lantern burning, the fire roaring in the stove, and the axe by my side. Somewhere outside, I thought I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. I pressed myself against the wall, straining to listen. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. I waited for what felt like hours before exhaustion claimed me. The following morning, I went outside to assess the situation. My first thought was that I had imagined it all, that isolation had frayed my nerves. But then I noticed the marks on the porch. Scratches, deep and jagged across the wood. Footprints leading around the cabin. Whoever or whatever had been here had been close enough to touch me. My stomach dropped. I began checking the perimeter, circling the cabin, examining every tree and bush. Nothing else. No figure, no movement, just the lingering impression that I was not alone. I decided to leave. My supplies were packed. I would drive back the same way I came. But as I approached my car, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The dirt road that led out of the forest had been disturbed. Large tire tracks embedded in the mud. They weren't fresh, not exactly, but they were deep, indicating a vehicle heavy enough to carry more than one person. Someone had been here, following me, maybe even anticipating my departure. I froze, trying to calm my breathing. I got in the car, locked the doors, and started the engine. The vehicle groaned as it shifted over rocks and tree roots. I glanced in the rearview mirror repeatedly, half expecting to see someone walking behind me, but there was nothing. The forest pressed in on either side, dark and silent. My eyes were fixed on the road ahead, and I drove as fast as I dared, trying to keep calm and rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was hunters, maybe it was another traveler. But deep down, I knew it had been intentional. Someone had been watching me, tracking me. The road stretched on endlessly, twisting and turning. I passed the clearing where I had seen the large footprints, now empty. My hands ached from gripping the wheel so tightly, and my knuckles were white. After what felt like hours, I finally reached the main highway, the forest thinning behind me. Relief washed over me in waves. I didn't stop until I reached a small gas station in a town far from the forest, the neon lights burning bright and welcoming. From there, I called the local sheriff's office and explained what had happened. They took my statement seriously but told me that the area was remote, that many cabins had occasional trespassers or people passing through who might not be seen immediately. No one could guarantee what I had encountered, and they advised me not to return. I didn't argue. Took weeks before I could sleep normally again. Every shadow, every unexpected sound, set my heart racing. I stopped taking trips into the wilderness for a long time, afraid of what might be lurking in places that seemed safe. I researched reports of cabin intrusions and found that people in remote areas were often targeted by those seeking to steal, intimidate, or worse. My experience had been mild compared to some cases, but it had been enough to remind me that isolation brings vulnerability. Eventually, I realized that the most important thing I had learned was how to respect that vulnerability. I upgraded the security of my own home, installed cameras, reinforced doors, and always made sure someone knew where I was going when I left. I never returned to that cabin, nor did I look for another one in such an isolated area. The fear that I had felt, the sense of being watched, followed, and alone is not easily forgotten. But in the end, I survived. I left the cabin, the forest, and the danger behind me. I returned to the world of other people, of traffic, noise, and light. It was a different kind of peace, one built on awareness and preparedness rather than isolation and escape. I learned that fear can be real, and it can be terrifying, but it can also teach you how to survive. I had walked into a forest alone, and I had walked out alive, carrying with me a memory that was raw, clear, and indelible, a lesson in vigilance and respect for the unknown dangers that exist not in legends or ghosts, but in real human threats. It started on a late September afternoon when I drove up the narrow dirt road toward the cabin I had rented for the weekend. The air was crisp, the kind that made your lungs feel cold and clean with every breath. The trees lining the road were dense, thick with leaves just starting to turn orange and red. I had been looking forward to this trip for months, wanting nothing more than a few days alone with my thoughts and the sound of the wind through the pines. The city noise, the constant demands of work, the ceaseless emails, they all felt like a distant memory the moment I turned off the main road. The cabin itself was small and rustic, built of dark timber with a stone chimney. It looked sturdier than I expected, which gave me a quiet comfort. The owner's description online made it sound isolated, and that was exactly what I wanted. No cell service, no neighbors, just the wilderness around me. I parked my car next to the cabin, stepping out into the cool air. The sun was already dipping behind the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I carried my backpack inside, noticing how the cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke and old pine. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and the air was heavy with the scent of damp earth seeping in from the forest outside. I set down my pack and began unpacking. The cabin had a small kitchenette, a wood-burning stove, a table, and a single bedroom tucked behind a partition. I made myself a quick dinner from the supplies I had brought, simple things: bread, cheese, canned beans, and a few apples. As I ate, I looked out the window at the forest, which was now mostly shadow, the trees swaying slightly in the wind. Everything was quiet, except for the distant rustle of leaves. At first, it was soothing, almost meditative, but as darkness fell, a different feeling crept in. The first night passed without incident, though sleep came fitfully. Every creak of the cabin, every snap of a branch outside made me tense. The isolation was profound. I realized how rarely I had been completely alone. I told myself it was fine, that I had chosen this solitude, and that it was normal for the mind to amplify every small sound in a strange place. By morning, though, the sun shining through the window reassured me. I spent the day hiking along the trail that led from the cabin. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and small animals, and I even spotted a deer moving silently through the trees. That evening, I returned to the cabin and built a fire in the stove. The warmth was comforting, and I ate another simple meal, feeling the day's tension slowly release from my body. But as the night deepened, I began to notice small things that unsettled me. A window I was sure I had closed was slightly ajar. My flashlight, which I had set on the table, was not in the same place I remembered. I shrugged it off as exhaustion or forgetfulness, but a small knot of unease had taken root in my stomach. The next day, I decided to explore more of the surrounding forest. I followed a faint trail that led to a small stream. The water was clear and cold, the rocks slippery beneath my boots. I sat for a long time by the stream, listening to the water and the wind through the trees, trying to shake the unease from the previous night. As I walked back to the cabin, the sun was already starting to dip, and the shadows were long and sharp. I quickened my pace, wanting to return before darkness fully set in. It was then I realized I had lost my way. The trail that had seemed so clear earlier was now confusing, splitting into multiple paths that all looked the same. Panic began to rise in me. I stopped, trying to get my bearings. I had left markers on the way in, small pieces of bark broken from the trail, but in the dimming light, I couldn't find them. My heart pounded, and I forced myself to slow my breathing. I told myself to stay calm, to retrace my steps carefully. Hours passed, or maybe it was only 30 minutes, I couldn't tell. The forest had grown darker than I expected, almost black in some places. The sound of the stream had vanished. Everything was still, too still, except for the occasional crack of a branch far off in the woods. I called out, even though there was no one to hear me, my voice sounding small and weak against the vast darkness. I started moving again, trying to remember which direction I had come from. Every path looked the same, twisted with roots and fallen leaves. My boots slipped in the mud, my hands scraping against bark and rocks. Fear settled deep in my chest, heavy and cold. Eventually, I stumbled upon a faint clearing and stopped to catch my breath. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach turn. Footprints, large and deep, pressed into the mud. They weren't human, at least not entirely. The shape was wrong, elongated, with claw-like impressions at the edges. I froze, trying to tell myself it must have been a deer or a large dog, but the size and depth of the prints suggested something heavier. My mind raced. I was miles from any other cabin, alone, with no one to help me. The shadows seemed to press in on me as I stood there, frozen. I knew staying still was dangerous. I had to keep moving, keep searching for the cabin. I tried to remember every detail of the trail I had taken, following what I hoped was the correct path. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, made me flinch. I started walking faster, my heart hammering in my chest. I tripped over a root and fell hard, scraping my hands and knees. Pain shot through me, but I forced myself to rise. The forest seemed endless, and the sun had long vanished. Darkness surrounded me, cold and oppressive. Hours passed, or maybe it was only 30 minutes, I couldn't tell. The forest had grown darker than I expected, almost black in some places. The sound of the stream had vanished. Everything was still, too still, except for the occasional crack of a branch far off in the woods. I called out, even though there was no one to hear me, my voice sounding small and weak against the vast darkness. I started moving again, trying to remember which direction I had come from. Every path looked the same, twisted with roots and fallen leaves. My boots slipped in the mud, my hands scraping against bark and rocks. Fear settled deep in my chest, heavy and cold. Eventually, I stumbled upon a faint clearing and stopped to catch my breath. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach turn. Footprints, large and deep, pressed into the mud. They weren't human, at least not entirely. The shape was wrong, elongated, with claw-like impressions at the edges. I froze, trying to tell myself it must have been a deer or a large dog, but the size and depth of the prints suggested something heavier. My mind raced. I was miles from any other cabin, alone, with no one to help me. The shadows seemed to press in on me as I stood there, frozen. I knew staying still was dangerous. I had to keep moving, keep searching for the cabin. I tried to remember every detail of the trail I had taken, following what I hoped was the correct path. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, made me flinch. I started walking faster, my heart hammering in my chest. I tripped over a root and fell hard, scraping my hands and knees. Pain shot through me, but I forced myself to rise. The forest seemed endless, and the sun had long vanished. Darkness surrounded me, cold and oppressive. Hours passed as I stumbled blindly, relying on memory and intuition. Hunger and exhaustion gnawed at me. At some point, I began to hallucinate, seeing shadows move where there were none, hearing whispers in the wind that weren't there. My fear was consuming me, but I forced myself to keep moving. Finally, I saw a faint light in the distance. My chest leapt with hope. I stumbled toward it, praying it was the cabin. The light grew brighter, warm and steady. I reached it and realized it was indeed the cabin. Relief washed over me in an overwhelming wave. I fell to my knees, panting and trembling, unable to believe I had made it back. I closed the door behind me, leaning against it, and slid to the floor. The cabin was safe, familiar, and warm. I cleaned myself up as best I could, tended to my scrapes, and finally allowed myself to eat a small portion of the food I had brought. That night, I stayed up by the stove, fire crackling, listening to the forest outside. Every sound made me jump, but I was determined to stay awake until morning. The fear from the forest had stayed with me, a deep, gnawing awareness that nature, while beautiful, was also vast, unpredictable, and potentially dangerous. Over the next 2 days, I stayed close to the cabin. I explored only the immediate surroundings, marking trees and rocks so I could retrace my steps safely. I became hyper-aware of every noise, the rustle of a small animal, the sound of wind through the pines, the distant call of birds. Each sound was a reminder of the world beyond the walls of the cabin, a world that could turn hostile in an instant. By the third day, I felt cautiously confident again. I ventured slightly further, still mapping the area and marking my trail. I found the stream again, now familiar and less intimidating. I realized that my fear had been amplified by the unfamiliarity and darkness. By respecting the forest and remaining vigilant, I could navigate it safely. When it was finally time to leave, I packed my things carefully, checking the cabin one last time to ensure I hadn't left anything behind. As I drove back down the narrow dirt road, the isolation of the forest behind me, I felt a mix of exhaustion and relief. I had survived, yes, but I had also learned something essential. Solitude in nature is powerful, humbling, and sometimes frightening. The cabin had been a sanctuary, a small refuge in the immense wilderness, and the experience had left a deep mark on me. I left with a newfound respect for the forest and for the fragility of human comfort when removed from civilization. The fear I had experienced was raw and real, but it was also a reminder of my own resilience. I realized that being alone in such a place demanded awareness, caution, and respect. The world outside the cabin was unpredictable, yes, but I had navigated it, survived it, and returned wiser. And as I looked back at the tree line from the road, I felt a strange mix of relief and longing. The forest had tested me, but it had also given me clarity. I knew I would never take isolation or the quiet beauty of nature for granted again. I had been planning this trip for months. Ever since I started working long hours at my office job, the stress and monotony of my life had begun to weigh heavily on me. I needed a break, a place where I could escape completely from the sounds of city life, the emails that never stopped, and the constant buzzing of notifications that seemed to control every part of my day. That was how I found myself driving through winding country roads in the middle of September, my backpack stuffed with nothing but essentials, a small cooler for food, and a camera I intended to use to capture the quiet wilderness. My destination was a small, remote cabin I had rented from a listing online. The pictures showed a simple wooden structure, surrounded by tall pines and overlooking a small lake. It looked isolated in every way a person could hope for when seeking peace. The drive itself had been long and tiring. The closer I got to the cabin, the narrower the roads became, and the thicker the forest seemed to grow around me. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of orange and red. At some point, the asphalt ended, giving way to a rough gravel road that shook my car as I slowly made my way forward. My heart was beating with a mix of excitement and anticipation. I had never stayed in a place this remote before, and the idea both thrilled and unnerved me. I reminded myself that the solitude was exactly why I wanted to come here. I needed it. Finally, I reached the cabin. It was even smaller than it had seemed online. A single-story structure with dark wood siding, a small porch, and windows that reflected the deepening sky. The area around it was completely open, with the forest starting a few dozen meters away. The lake behind it shimmered faintly in the last light of the day. I parked my car and took a deep breath, inhaling the cold, clean air. It smelled of pine and earth and something faintly sweet that I couldn't quite place. It was a smell that reminded me of childhood camping trips, though I had never been anywhere this remote alone. I unpacked quickly and carried my bags inside. The cabin was rustic but clean. There was a small living area with a worn sofa, a wood stove, a tiny kitchen with a sink, a stove, and a fridge, and one bedroom with a narrow bed and a few shelves. The bathroom was basic, a small shower, a sink, and a toilet. I walked around, inspecting everything. The floor creaked under my weight in certain places, and the wood had that faint, musky smell of an old building that had been closed up for a while. It was perfect for what I wanted. Quiet, isolated, and completely disconnected from the world. I decided to make a fire before it got fully dark. I had brought firewood, matches, and kindling, and there was already a stack near the stove. I set up the fire carefully, the wood snapping as it caught flame. The small room quickly warmed up, and the shadows from the flickering flames danced across the walls. I stood for a moment, just watching, feeling a calm settle over me. Outside, I could hear the wind rustling through the trees, and from the direction of the lake, the faint splash of water as a fish jumped. It was so peaceful it almost felt unreal. Almost. As night fell, I made a simple dinner, a can of beans heated on the stove, and a few slices of bread. I ate slowly, listening to the sounds outside, noticing how different they were from the city. There were no cars, no distant sirens, no voices. Just wind and water and the occasional crack of a branch. I took out my camera and walked to the porch, aiming to take some shots of the stars. The sky was incredible. Away from the light pollution, the Milky Way stretched across the sky in vivid detail, and countless stars twinkled in a way I had only ever seen in books. I felt small, but in a good way. I went to bed early, exhausted from the drive and the day's preparations. The bed was firm but comfortable, and I quickly fell asleep to the sounds of the forest outside. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to a strange noise. At first, I thought it was the wind, but as I lay there listening, I realized it was a pattern. Someone walking outside, just beyond the porch. My heart jumped. I stayed still for several minutes, straining to hear over my own breathing. The sound stopped. I told myself it was an animal, probably a deer or a raccoon, and tried to go back to sleep. But the sound returned, this time closer, and I realized the walking was deliberate. Someone was moving around my cabin. I got out of bed quietly, grabbed the small flashlight I had brought, and moved to the window. Peering through the curtains, I couldn't see anything at first. The darkness was thick, and the trees obscured much of the area around the cabin. Then, a shadow moved across the porch, almost gliding. My heart pounded in my chest. I considered calling the police, but my phone had barely any signal, and I didn't want to alert whoever it was. I thought about my options. The front door was the only exit, and it was too late to leave unnoticed. I decided to arm myself as best as I could. I grabbed a heavy flashlight and a kitchen knife from the drawer. The walking continued, faintly, outside, moving around the cabin in circles. I stayed in the living area, crouched low, shining my flashlight through the windows, trying to catch a glimpse. The beam of light finally landed on something or someone, a figure standing just beyond the edge of the porch. It was impossible to see details, but I could make out the silhouette of a person. They weren't doing anything, just standing there, watching. I stayed absolutely still, hoping they would go away, but the figure moved closer and then stopped again. My mind raced. What were they doing here? Was it a robber, someone who wanted to hurt me, or just a lost person? The possibilities spiraled, each worse than the last. I realized that I couldn't stay paralyzed. I needed to secure the cabin to make myself safe until I could get help. I moved quietly to the door, checking the locks. The cabin had a simple latch, nothing fancy, but it was better than nothing. I locked it, then pulled a chair underneath the handle for extra security. The figure outside didn't try to open it. Instead, they circled the cabin, moving slowly, almost methodically. I realized that they were trying to find a way in, probably looking for an unlocked door or window. My stomach sank. I had a window near the bedroom, another in the kitchen. I ran from window to window, ensuring they were locked, using the flashlight to check for footprints or signs of tampering. Everything seemed intact, but the figure was still out there. Hours passed like this. I stayed awake, crouched behind the sofa, listening to every sound. The wind shifted, the trees creaked, and I could hear twigs snapping underfoot. Once, I thought I saw a movement through a window, but when I shone the flashlight, nothing was there. Exhaustion began to set in, but I couldn't risk sleep. Couldn't let my guard down. I tried to keep calm, telling myself that dawn would come, and with it, safety. As the first light of morning filtered through the trees, I finally caught a clearer look. The figure was gone. No footprints in the soft dirt, no signs of forced entry. It was as if whoever it had been had disappeared into the forest overnight. I sat on the porch steps, shaking, exhausted, and tried to process what had happened. I felt violated, scared, and still very much alone. I spent the day assessing the cabin, trying to find any clues or ways someone could have gotten in. There were none. I realized that I had to get help and leave. I packed my things quickly, leaving the cabin in the same condition I had found it, and started the drive back. Every sound of the forest, every bend in the road, felt threatening, as if the person from last night could appear again at any moment. The drive was tense, my senses alert to everything around me. I finally reached a small town and called the local police, explaining the situation. They promised to send a patrol to check the cabin. In the weeks afterward, I learned from the local authorities that there had been a series of break-ins in the area. It seemed likely that someone had been scouting the cabin for days and had entered only if the opportunity arose. They never found the intruder, but they reassured me that the area was now being monitored more closely. I felt some relief, knowing that I was not imagining things, that what I had experienced was real. The experience changed me. I realized that solitude in the wilderness, while beautiful, comes with risks. I became more cautious, more aware of my surroundings, and I never again stayed somewhere so isolated without proper security measures. But I also didn't let it stop me from seeking the quiet I craved. I returned to nature many times afterward, always prepared, always alert, but with a newfound respect for the unpredictability of life in the wild. I had always enjoyed the solitude of nature. The city, with its constant noise and endless movement, never gave me a sense of peace. That's why, when I found a small cabin for rent deep in the forest, I jumped at the opportunity. It wasn't advertised as anything fancy, just a small wooden structure with basic amenities, nestled on the edge of a dense pine forest. The photos made it look cozy, and the owner assured me that the nearest neighbor was miles away. The promise of isolation, of being completely alone with only the sounds of the forest around me, was exactly what I wanted. I drove for hours along winding dirt roads, passing through small, scattered towns, their streets quiet and empty as the sun started its slow descent. The road became narrower, more uneven, with deep ruts filled with rainwater from the recent storm. By the time I arrived at the cabin, it was late afternoon. The sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, sending long shadows across the forest floor. The cabin itself was modest, just one floor with a small porch. It smelled faintly of wood smoke and damp earth, a mixture that, strangely, made me feel at home immediately. I unloaded my car, carrying my bags into the cabin. Inside, it was simple but comfortable. A small kitchen with a stove and refrigerator, a table with 2 chairs, a living area with an old but sturdy sofa, and a small bedroom with a bed and a worn dresser. The windows looked out into the forest, and the silence was almost overwhelming. I unpacked slowly, setting everything in its place, feeling the tension of city life begin to melt away. By the time I finished, the sky had turned shades of orange and pink, and the first birds of evening were calling to each other in the trees. I decided to start a fire in the small stone fireplace in the living room. I stacked the logs carefully, struck a match, and watched as the flames slowly took hold, crackling and filling the room with warmth. The firelight danced on the walls, and I felt a deep sense of contentment. For hours, I sat in the cabin, watching the flames, listening to the sounds of the forest. The occasional snap of a branch or rustle of leaves made me pause for a moment, but it was the kind of tension I welcomed, the thrill of being completely alone in nature. Night fell quickly, and soon the darkness outside was nearly absolute. The moon rose, but the thick canopy of trees blocked most of its light, leaving the forest in shadow. I went to bed early, the warmth of the fire still comforting. I had intended to sleep soundly, but I was awakened in the middle of the night by a sound I couldn't immediately identify. It was faint at first, just a subtle creaking, like wood shifting, but it seemed deliberate. I froze, straining to listen. The sound came again, closer this time, and I realized it was coming from outside the cabin. At first, I told myself it was probably an animal. Deer, maybe, or a raccoon. I had read that forests at night were alive with creatures, and it wasn't unusual to hear them moving near human dwellings. But the sound continued, and it didn't match anything I recognized. It was more of a scraping, like something dragging across the dirt, punctuated by occasional thuds. My heart rate quickened, and I moved closer to the window, trying to see through the darkness. The shadows between the trees were dense, but I thought I saw a figure moving, just on the edge of my vision. I blinked, and it was gone. I sat in bed, tense, trying to rationalize what I had seen. Maybe I was imagining it, tired and alone, letting my mind play tricks on me. I checked my phone, hoping for some light, but the signal was nearly non-existent, just 1 bar at most. Panic began to creep in as I realized I was entirely cut off from the outside world. There was no one to call, no way to alert anyone if something went wrong. I felt the first real fear of the trip, the kind that settles deep in your chest, heavy and insistent. The sound didn't stop. It continued, rhythmic and deliberate, moving slowly around the cabin. I could hear the faint scrape of something against the wooden exterior, small taps as if something was testing the structure. I thought about the locks on the doors and windows, but the cabin was old, and I knew they might not hold up if someone or something wanted in. I tried to calm myself, reminding myself that it was probably an animal, a deer or a bear. Bears were common in these woods, I had read, and they could be destructive, knocking over trash or breaking into buildings in search of food. I waited until the sounds outside stopped. Hours passed, but sleep did not return. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined movement in the dark, eyes reflecting light, shapes shifting just beyond the trees. The first light of dawn was a relief, washing the forest in a soft, golden hue. I got up cautiously, moving to the window and peering out. There were no signs of animals or humans, nothing disturbed except for the leaves on the ground. But then I noticed the marks on the wooden porch, deep scratches, as if something had clawed at the wood. I froze, examining them closely. They were too high and too deliberate to be from a bear. My stomach turned as I realized that something had been outside, possibly watching me, and it hadn't been an animal. I spent the day on edge. I didn't leave the cabin, instead pacing inside, checking the locks, the windows, even the fireplace. I made sure the firewood was stacked in a way that could create a barrier if needed. I rationed my food and water carefully, aware that I had no way to replenish supplies quickly. As the day turned to night again, the forest seemed to darken in a way that felt almost alive, shadows lengthening and deepening. The sounds returned, quieter at first, then louder, scraping and tapping against the cabin walls. My fear was compounded by isolation. No one nearby, no way to know if anyone would come if I needed help. The night passed slowly. I remained awake, sitting near the fireplace with a heavy metal poker in hand, listening. The figure outside never showed itself clearly, only glimpses in the shadows, movements just at the edge of my vision. I began to notice other things. Footprints in the soft earth around the cabin, too large to be any common animal, and the occasional small branch snapped as if someone or something was testing my defenses. I realized the danger was not imagined. Someone had been outside the cabin, and they might return. The realization sent a chill down my spine. By the third day, I had adapted to a constant vigilance. I barricaded the doors more securely, moving furniture to reinforce them, and checked every window. I avoided going outside unless absolutely necessary. My food was running low, and I began rationing it more strictly. The sounds at night became almost routine, the scraping, the tapping, the rustling of leaves, but I no longer tried to rationalize them. I accepted that someone was out there, and I had to survive until help arrived. I began to take notes, documenting every sound, every movement, and every mark I saw. It became a strategy to stay calm, to maintain control in a situation where I felt powerless. On the fourth night, I heard something different. It wasn't outside, but inside the cabin. A soft, almost imperceptible sound from the kitchen. My heart leapt into my throat. I moved quietly, the poker ready, and crept toward the sound. Everything appeared normal until I noticed the small cabinet door slightly ajar. I had closed it earlier. I was certain of it. My pulse raced as I realized that the intruder had been inside the cabin while I was awake, just hours before. Panic surged, but I forced myself to stay calm. I checked the other doors, the windows, the bedroom, every corner of the cabin. Nothing seemed disturbed except that cabinet. But the knowledge that someone had entered while I slept made the fear almost unbearable. I stayed awake the entire fifth night, too terrified to close my eyes. I listened to every creak, every whisper of movement outside. At one point, I heard a faint sound of footsteps on the porch. I gripped the poker, my hands shaking, ready for confrontation. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and for a long while, there was silence. Then the scraping started again, but farther away, moving around the cabin. My fear had evolved into a sharp, focused awareness. I learned to track the sounds, to anticipate movement, and to prepare for the worst. By the sixth day, I knew I had to act. I couldn't stay indefinitely without risking starvation or dehydration. I remembered the dirt road I had driven along, and I decided to make a run for it at first light. I packed the few supplies I had left into a backpack. A small amount of food, water, a flashlight, and the poker for protection. I waited until dawn, watching the forest carefully, and then moved toward the door. The forest was quiet as I stepped outside. I moved quickly, sticking to the shadows, watching for any signs of movement. I followed the path that led to the main road, my senses alert to every sound. Hours passed, and I finally saw the faint outline of a vehicle on the dirt road. Relief surged through me. I ran toward it, waving frantically. The driver stopped, a middle-aged man with a concerned expression. I explained my situation as best I could, my voice shaking. He listened carefully and immediately called the authorities. The police arrived within an hour. They searched the area thoroughly and discovered signs of someone having camped nearby, making temporary shelters and leaving footprints. There were no suspects immediately, but they assured me that the evidence suggested an individual had been watching the cabin for days, possibly intending to harm anyone who stayed there. They praised me for staying vigilant and following safety precautions, emphasizing that my careful actions had prevented a potential disaster. After the authorities left, I returned to the cabin one last time to collect the remaining belongings. The scratches on the porch, the marks on the doors, and the footprints in the dirt were stark reminders of what had occurred. I took detailed photographs and left everything as evidence for the investigation. The cabin, once a symbol of peace and solitude, had become a place of fear and survival. I locked the doors, leaving the keys with the authorities, and drove away, the forest fading behind me. In the weeks that followed, I struggled to shake the lingering fear, but I also felt a strange sense of pride. I had faced a terrifying situation, relied on my instincts, and survived. I learned how to remain calm under pressure, to assess danger realistically, and to act decisively. Most importantly, I understood the value of preparation and vigilance. The experience changed me profoundly, making me more cautious but also more capable of handling unexpected threats. The cabin remained a dark memory, a place where fear had been real, but the ending was clear. I survived, I acted wisely, and I escaped a situation that could have been fatal. Even now, months later, I think about that cabin often. I remember the sound of scraping at night, the shadows moving just beyond the window, the fear that had settled in my chest like a stone. But I also remember the fire I started on the first night, the meticulous preparation, and the careful attention that ultimately saved me. The forest, once serene and inviting, had revealed its hidden dangers, but I walked away alive, wiser, and stronger than before.